It began with a strange package, but not the kind you'd find on your doorstep. This one was tucked into my P.O. box at the post office, nestled between a flyer for gutter cleaning and a coupon for 10% off tires. I almost didn't notice it. A small brown envelope, frayed at the edges, the address handwritten in precise but unfamiliar script. No return address. No sender. Just my name and a single wax seal on the back, pressed with an emblem I didn't recognize. A star with too many points, sharp and uneven, like it had been drawn in a hurry. I almost left it there. In a world where scams, anthrax scares, and existential dread were part of the daily landscape, picking up an unmarked envelope felt like tempting fate. But something about it pulled at me. Not curiosity, exactly, but a quiet insistence, like a melody I couldn't place. So, against my better judgment, I slipped it into my bag and took it home. I didn't open it right away. It sat on the table for hours while I paced the room, giving myself increasingly absurd reasons not to touch it. It's probably a mistake, I muttered. Someone else's weird secret. But as the afternoon light faded and the house grew quieter, the envelope seemed to grow louder, humming softly in the back of my mind. Finally, as the clock ticked past midnight, I gave in. The seal broke easily, the wax crumbling between my fingers. Inside was a single card, thick and slightly textured, like the pages of an old book. It was blank except for 4 words scrawled in black ink. Bring this, 12:17 p.m. No date, no location, just a time. My first reaction was irritation. Was this some kind of prank? A marketing stunt? But the handwriting, sharp, deliberate, almost alive, made it hard to dismiss. And then there was the time. Not noon, not quarter past. 12:17 exactly. I should have thrown it away, forgotten about it, and moved on. But something about the card stuck with me. The next morning, I found myself walking through the city, the card tucked in my pocket, unsure of where I was going, but moving with a strange certainty. At exactly 12:17 p.m., I found myself in front of an old, unmarked building at the edge of the historic district. Its facade was weathered brick, its windows darkened, and its heavy wooden door bore no sign or number. The card grew warm in my pocket, as if it knew we'd arrived. I hesitated, half expecting the door to be locked, but it swung open at my touch. Inside was a room unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was vast, the walls lined with mismatched shelves filled with objects that seemed plucked from every corner of history. A golden pocket watch that ticked without hands, a violin with strings that glimmered like moonlight, and jars of strange, iridescent powders that seemed to shift colors when you blinked. The air smelled faintly of cedar and something sweeter, like burnt sugar. At the center of the room was a desk, and behind it sat a man. He looked ordinary in the way an illusionist looks before the trick. Faded suit, neatly combed hair, but with eyes so piercing they felt like they could peel back layers of thought. "You brought it," he said, his voice low and smooth, like a river cutting through stone. "I don't even know what it is," I said, pulling the card from my pocket and holding it up. He smiled faintly, his fingers steepled. "That's what we're here to find out." Before I could ask what that meant, he gestured for me to sit in the chair opposite him. On the desk between us was a small, ornate box, its surface carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and shimmer in the dim light. "Your card is the key," he said simply. I hesitated. "What happens if I open it?" "That depends," he said, his eyes unreadable. "The box only reveals what you've lost." "What I've lost?" I laughed nervously. "Like my spare socks? My willpower? What are we talking about here?" He didn't laugh. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if he could see straight through me. "The thing you've misplaced," he said, "but haven't forgotten. The part of you that's been waiting to be found." My mouth went dry. I wanted to argue, to demand answers, but the box seemed to hum softly, its presence undeniable. Without thinking, I slipped the card into the slot on its front. The lid clicked open. Inside was a single, delicate object, a compass. It wasn't like any compass I'd ever seen. Its casing was dark metal, polished to a mirror-like finish, and the needle glowed faintly, trembling as if it were alive. But it didn't point north. It spun slowly, pausing at odd angles before changing direction again. "What is this?" I whispered. "The compass of your moments," the man said. "It doesn't lead to places. It leads to choices." I looked up at him, confused. Choices? Every decision you've ever avoided. Every path you hesitated to take. Every version of yourself you left behind. He leaned forward slightly. "It's not telling you where to go. It's asking where you want to be." The room seemed to tilt, the air growing heavy with possibility. My mind raced, thinking of all the things I'd abandoned or buried over the years. Dreams I'd dismissed. People I'd let slip away. Parts of myself I'd silenced because they were too loud, too bright, too complicated. I stared at the compass, its needle quivering, and felt a strange pull in my chest, a mix of longing and fear. "Take it," the man said softly. "But understand this, it's not a gift. It's a question." When I left the building, the compass was warm in my hand. The city seemed sharper, the streets alive with currents I'd never noticed before. I didn't know where I was going, but for the first time in years, I felt like I might actually want to find out. So, have you ever felt like the universe handed you something not to explain, but to ask? Something that made you wonder not what's next, but who you could be if you let yourself find out. Let's start a new story. I never meant to get lost, but somehow I ended up there. On that strange road with the twisting trees, their branches stretching like fingers scraping the sky. At first, I thought it was just the storm making me feel uneasy. The rain came in waves, like it was a rhythm I couldn't quite follow, drowning out the sound of my tires against the wet asphalt. My windshield wipers kept struggling, as if even they were uncertain of the road ahead. But the longer I drove, the more I realized something was off. I've been on a back road somewhere in the middle of nowhere. The kind of place where your phone loses signal, and the horizon feels like it's pressing down on you, suffocating you with its silence. That's when I saw it, a sign, half hidden by moss, barely legible, hanging at a crooked angle. It read, "Welcome to Belwick." I don't know why I didn't turn around right then. Maybe it was the curious part of me, the one that wants to know where every road goes, even the ones that don't look like they're meant to be traveled. Or maybe it was the lure of the name, something nostalgic and soothing about it. Belwick. It sounded like the sort of place where time didn't matter, where people still took long walks to the general store, and the clock tower chimed every hour with the kind of echo you can feel deep in your chest. I thought I'd just pass through, but Belwick had a way of making you feel like you were meant to stay. The road narrowed, the trees closing in on both sides, their thick trunks blocking out the light. The air smelled of damp earth and something sweeter, as if the whole place were drenched in honey and autumn leaves. I slowed the car, the engine sputtering like it was getting tired of being here too. Then I saw it, the house. It wasn't the kind of house that belongs on a main street. It was tucked away at the edge of the forest, at the very end of the road, like it had been forgotten by the rest of the world. Its windows were dark and wide, as if they had too many stories to keep to themselves. Ivy covered most of the facade, curling around the edges like a veil. The house didn't look abandoned, but it didn't look alive either. It was frozen in time, a relic. Before I could change my mind, I pulled up to the gate. The driveway was lined with uneven stones, and the air smelled heavier the closer I got. The rain had stopped, but the atmosphere felt charged, as if the storm had only just passed through, leaving its mark in the form of an electric hum. The front door of the house swung open without a sound. I didn't expect anyone to be there. I wasn't supposed to be there either, I guess. But somehow, my feet moved toward the door, like they already knew what was coming. Inside, the air was thick and warm, like it had been waiting for me. The house had the unmistakable scent of old wood, polished furniture, and dust. The kind of smell that always makes you think of people long gone. Yet, there were signs of life. A book on the table, a chair pushed out from the desk, a half-empty glass of water with a ring around the bottom, as if someone had just been sitting there, waiting. That's when I heard the sound, the faintest hum. A tune, not quite familiar, but strangely comforting. It seemed to be coming from upstairs. I don't know why I went up, but I did. The stairs creaked under my weight, the wood groaning as if the house itself were stretching, waking up from a long slumber. At the top of the stairs, The hallway stretched long and narrow, its walls covered in photographs. Black and white pictures of people I didn't know, family portraits, wedding photos, smiling children. But there was something off about them. The smiles didn't quite reach their eyes. They were frozen in time, just like the house, stuck in a moment that could never be revisited. At the end of the hallway, a door stood ajar. I didn't hear the music anymore, but something inside pulled me toward it. I stepped inside. The room was small and cozy, with a window that looked out over the overgrown garden below. On the desk in the corner was an old record player, a needle gently spinning in the silence. The air felt different here, thick, almost like it was made of something heavier than just air. I stepped closer to the desk and noticed a piece of paper beside the record player, yellowed with age, folded in half. I unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was elegant, looping, as if written by someone with a steady hand. "I'll wait for you here, as we promised. Come find me." I didn't know why, but I knew who had written it. A soft breath escaped my lips. There was something about that handwriting, something I couldn't explain, and that's when I saw it. A shadow in the corner, shifting, moving without sound. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then it moved again, this time closer, filling the space between me and the door. My heart stopped. The figure that emerged from the shadow wasn't quite solid, but it was there, clear enough to see. A woman, dressed in white, her long hair flowing like water, her face pale and unmarked by time. She didn't speak, but I could feel her eyes on me, her gaze locking with mine, as though she knew something about me that I didn't understand. I should have been afraid, but I wasn't. There was something gentle about her presence, like she was a part of this house, a part of this place. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper, though my voice seemed too quiet, too small in the face of whatever this was. She didn't answer, but she smiled. A small, knowing smile. And then, in a voice that felt like it came from everywhere and nowhere, she said, "You've found me. Just like we said, now we can finally leave together." The air in the room shifted. The walls seemed to breathe in, then exhale with a sigh, and the clock on the wall started ticking, slowly but steadily, as though it had forgotten what time was for. The world outside the window seemed to dissolve, and suddenly, it wasn't raining anymore. The garden below bloomed, flowers opening in the stillness, bursting with color as if it were the height of spring. The woman's form blurred, then solidified again, and with it, I felt something shift in my chest like a knot unraveling. "Leave?" But I began, my mind struggling to understand. She held up her hand, and the words fell silent. "The house is not a place. It is a promise, and you've kept yours." Before I could process it all, she reached for my hand. Her fingers were cold, like the first touch of winter. And as soon as our hands met, I felt the world shift, felt it break apart and fall away like the last echoes of a dream. When I opened my eyes again, I was standing outside the house, at the edge of the forest. The rain had started again, but this time it felt different. Lighter. The wind blew through the trees, carrying a faint, distant melody, soft like a lullaby, drifting on the breeze. I turned back to look at the house, but it was gone. Just gone. And though I couldn't explain it, I felt lighter. Like a weight had been lifted off me that I didn't even know I was carrying. Belwick had been a place for lost promises, a home for the things people had left behind. But somehow, by stepping into its story, I had found my own. Have you ever stumbled upon a place you didn't know you were supposed to find? A place that seemed forgotten, but still somehow remembered you? Let's start a new story. It was raining the night I found the journal. Not a soft, drizzling rain, the kind you might welcome as poetic, but an angry downpour that battered rooftops and turned streets into rivers. I had just moved into a new apartment, the kind landlords describe as cozy when they mean claustrophobic. Cardboard boxes were scattered around me like fallen dominoes, their contents spilling out into the chaos of unpacking. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just digging through an old suitcase I hadn't opened in years. That's when my fingers brushed against something hard and unfamiliar. Not the smooth surface of a forgotten book or the crinkle of a misplaced photograph, but a rough, leather-bound journal with corners rubbed raw from time. My heart skipped in recognition before I even opened it. This wasn't just any journal, it was my journal. I hadn't seen it since I was 13. I stared at the cover, its surface etched with faint scratches, and felt a strange tightening in my chest. The rain hammered harder against the windows, as if urging me on. Slowly, I flipped it open. The first page was a mess of smudged ink and my younger self's untamed scrawl. This is not a diary. Diaries are lame. This is my adventure book. My adventure book. The words hit me like a long-forgotten melody, tugging at the edges of my memory. I flipped to the next page, and then the next, and suddenly, I was back in my 13-year-old body, curled up in the corner of my childhood room, scribbling furiously by flashlight after bedtime. There were sketches, terrible, lopsided ones, of dragons and treasure maps. Lists of secret plans for adventures I never quite managed to pull off. A wildly optimistic bucket list. 1. Find a real buried treasure. 2. Learn to ride a horse like a knight, not like a tourist. 3. Build a time machine. But it wasn't just the grand, impossible dreams that got to me. It was the small moments I had captured in shaky, looping handwriting. Saw fireflies tonight. They look like stars you can touch. Or tried to make a secret hideout in the woods, but the branches kept breaking. Got mud all over my jeans. Worth it. I laughed, even as my throat tightened. How had I forgotten all this? Not just the details, but the feeling, that electric sense of possibility, of the world being a canvas I couldn't wait to paint on. But then I reached a page that made me freeze. The handwriting was different. Sharper. Angrier. Adventure book is stupid. What's the point of making plans when they never work? Lost the map I made today. Lost everything. Dumb. I remembered that day. Vividly. It was the day I'd gotten lost in the woods behind my house, clutching a map I'd drawn myself. Convinced I'd find a hidden stream I'd read about in a book. I didn't. I got turned around, scraped my knees, and came home covered in dirt, my map torn to pieces in my hands. That was the last time I'd written in the adventure book. After that, it had been shoved into the suitcase and forgotten, buried under years of growing up. I sat there on the floor, the journal open in my lap, and felt a wave of something I couldn't name. It wasn't just nostalgia. It was a kind of grief. Not for the journal, but for the version of me who had written it. The kid who believed in treasure maps and time machines. The kid who wasn't afraid to dream, even if it meant getting lost. The rain outside slowed to a soft patter. My apartment felt quieter, like the world itself was waiting for me to decide what to do next. That's when I grabbed a pen. Flipping to the very last page of the journal, I drew a line beneath my 13-year-old self's final entry. Then, in bold letters, I wrote, "The adventure book is back." The words looked strange on the page, smaller than I remembered, less confident, but they were mine. I grinned and started writing. I wrote about the rain and the cardboard boxes and the way the journal had found me, as if it had been waiting all this time for the right moment to return. I wrote about how scared I'd been to leave my old life behind, to start over in a city where I knew no one. But most of all, I wrote about what I wanted to do next. The bucket list began to take shape, not as grand or wild as before, but just as exciting. 1. Find the best pizza in the city. 2. Go stargazing without checking my phone. 3. Learn something completely ridiculous like juggling. 4. Get lost on purpose. When I finally looked up, the rain had stopped. The apartment was still cluttered, but it didn't feel so small anymore. The adventure book sat open beside me, its pages ready to hold whatever came next. I don't know if I'll ever find buried treasure or build a time machine, but for the first time in years, I feel like it doesn't matter. What matters is that I'm writing again, that I'm dreaming again, that somewhere inside me, that 13-year-old kid is grinning ear to ear, ready to explore. What about you? Have you ever stumbled across something that reminded you of who you used to be and made you want to chase after that version of yourself again? Let's start a new story. It started with a sound, faint, rhythmic, and impossible, like a heartbeat but not quite. It came late one night as I was finishing up a project in the school's darkroom. Photography class had always been my escape, a place where everything faded except the quiet ritual of light and shadow. But that night, as I stood waiting for my print to develop, I felt something shift in the air. The sound was faint at first, a low thrum-thrum, like someone was knocking on the edge of reality. I turned, expecting to see Mr. Lawrence, the photography teacher, but the room was empty. Just the smell of chemicals and the faint glow of the safety lights. The sound grew louder, coming from the far side of the room where the cabinet stood. My chest tightened, and I told myself it was just an old pipe or the building settling. It was an old school, after all, but the sound was too deliberate, too alive. Curiosity overrode fear, and I walked to the cabinets. As I reached for the handle, the sound stopped. The silence was absolute, the kind that swallows everything whole. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something move, a flicker like a shadow that didn't belong. I yanked the cabinet open, expecting nothing but stacks of photo paper. Instead, I found a door. It was small, barely tall enough for me to crouch through, and covered in scratches like something had tried to claw its way in or out. There was no reason it should have been there. The cabinets were bolted to the wall, and behind them was nothing but brick. But the door was real. Its frame pulsed faintly with the same thrum-thrum, and as I stared, I noticed a keyhole in its center. That's when I saw it. On the cabinet shelf, half buried in a stack of negatives, was an old brass key. It looked ancient, the metal worn smooth like it had passed through countless hands. Against every ounce of logic in my body, I picked it up. The moment my fingers touched it, the heartbeat returned, louder this time, almost excited. I don't remember deciding to unlock the door. It just happened. The key slid in perfectly, and with a soft click, the door swung inward. Behind it was a narrow staircase spiraling down into darkness. I hesitated, glancing back at the darkroom door. The safety lights flickered, as if daring me to stay. But the sound from the stairwell was pulling me, drawing me in like a magnet. Before I could think twice, I stepped through. The staircase was cold, the air thick with the scent of damp stone. I pulled out my phone for light, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness. The heartbeat grew louder with every step, until it wasn't just a sound. It was a vibration, pulsing through the air, the walls, my chest. At the bottom of the stairs was a room. It was massive, far too large to fit beneath the school. The walls were covered in intricate carvings, spirals, interlocking circles, symbols that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it rested a camera. It was an old model, one of those antique ones with bellows and a crank. Its lens gleamed faintly, as if it were alive. And beside it, carved into the stone of the pedestal, was a single sentence: "Frame the truth, or lose it forever." I didn't understand what it meant, but the urge to touch the camera was overwhelming. My hands moved on their own, lifting it carefully from the pedestal. The moment I held it, the room shifted. The walls stretched, the carvings writhing like they were alive. The heartbeat stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. Then, through the camera's viewfinder, I saw them. Figures. Dozens of them, shadowy and translucent, standing just at the edge of the light. Their faces were indistinct, but their eyes burned with faint, golden light. They weren't human, or at least, not anymore. One of them stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. It raised a hand, pointing at the camera in my hands. "Frame the truth," it said, its voice a low echo. I didn't know what to do. My hands were shaking, but the instinct to obey was stronger than fear. I raised the camera to my eye and looked through the viewfinder. The room transformed. Through the lens, the carvings on the walls glowed with golden light, forming images that moved like memories caught in time. I turned the crank, and the camera whirred to life. As it did, the shadows began to move, their shapes distorting, blending into the carvings. Each frame I captured seemed to draw something from them, bits of their forms melting into the film, leaving behind faint whispers of what they had been. With every click of the shutter, the figures grew fainter. Their golden eyes dimmed, and their shapes dissolved into the walls, becoming part of the carvings. The last figure, the one who had spoken, lingered for a moment longer. "You see now," it said almost gently. "Every truth costs something." The final click of the camera drained the light from its eyes, and then it was gone. The room fell silent. The carvings on the walls stopped moving, frozen in place like a mural. The camera in my hands was warm, its lens glowing faintly with golden light. I felt like I had stolen something, though I couldn't name what. When I climbed back up the stairs, the door closed behind me, sealing itself as if it had never been there. I stood in the dark room, the camera still in my hands, the world around me feeling impossibly still. I didn't tell anyone what happened, but over the next few days, I started noticing things. People I passed in the hall seemed different, like they were missing something, pieces of themselves they didn't even realize were gone. And when I developed the film from the camera, I saw why. The negatives didn't hold pictures of the carvings or the figures. Instead, they showed faces, students, teachers, even strangers I didn't recognize, all staring out of the film, their eyes faintly glowing with golden light. I don't use the camera anymore. I've locked it away, but I can still feel its pull, like it's waiting for me to pick it up again. And sometimes late at night, I hear it soft and rhythmic like a heartbeat. Let's start a new story. I wasn't sure what door it was. There was no one else in the house. At least I didn't think there was. It was the middle of the night, just past 3 a.m., and the house had settled into that strange, muffled silence it gets when no one is awake. Still, the door closed with a soft, deliberate thud that echoed through the halls. It wasn't a noise I could ignore. I lay in bed for several minutes, listening, waiting for something more to follow. But nothing did. The house just breathed around me, its creaks and sighs the kind of sounds it made when it was alone with its secrets. I tried to brush it off as the wind, maybe, but the longer I lay there, the more convinced I became that it wasn't wind. I didn't hear it when I closed the door earlier that evening, nor did I hear it when I walked through the hall on my way to bed. It had come from somewhere else, a place that wasn't part of the house I knew. I swung my legs out from under the covers and stood, my bare feet hitting the cool floor. The hallway outside my bedroom was pitch black, the kind of darkness that didn't offer any answers, only more questions. I took a deep breath and walked toward the stairs. The door to the basement was ajar. I hadn't opened it. Not tonight, not ever. In fact, I hadn't opened it in years. When I first moved in, I had peered down into the basement once, my curiosity poking at me, but the feeling of something pressing against the edges of my vision had made me close it quickly, the way you slam a book shut before you get to the last chapter. I was too afraid to ask the previous owners why the basement was locked, too afraid to admit that I had no idea what might be hiding down there. But tonight, in the quiet, I found myself standing in front of it again. The door had swung open, just wide enough for me to see the blackness beyond. Something in the darkness shifted. I took a step forward, my heart racing. Another step. The sound of my own breath felt like a shout in the silence, too loud, too out of place. I glanced down at the stairs leading into the basement, my mind screaming at me to turn around, to go back to bed and forget about it. But I didn't. I couldn't. The door closed behind me, slowly, gently, as if someone had followed me in and didn't want me to know. The flashlight I grabbed from the kitchen flickered to life, casting a trembling beam across the stairs. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, watching, waiting. When I stepped down, the smell hit me, a mixture of dampness, something sour, and something else, something almost metallic. I swallowed, pushing the thought away. The stairs creaked under my feet, but the deeper I went, the quieter they seemed. The air grew colder, thicker, like it was resisting me, pushing back. At the bottom of the stairs, the flashlight illuminated the familiar sight of old shelves stacked with boxes. But something was different. A shadow moved in the corner of the room. I froze. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind or a draft. It was something else, something darker, something more alive. I stepped forward, the beam of light trembling in my hand. Then at the far end of the room, I saw it. There was a door. Not a door that belonged here. It wasn't part of the house. The wood was old, faded, and the brass handle was tarnished with age. It had no reason to be there, and yet it was. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't noticed it before. I had never seen it before. But now, it was like it had always been there, waiting for me to see it. I reached for the handle. My fingers brushed the cold metal, and for a moment, I thought about turning back. But the idea of leaving, of walking back upstairs to my bed without finding out what was behind that door, was unbearable. The door swung open easily, as if it had been expecting me. Beyond it was an impossibly small room. Too small, too cramped for the basement. A single chair sat in the center, its wood cracked and worn. And on the floor, curled in the corner, was a pile of papers. At first, I thought they were nothing more than old, yellowed notes, forgotten scraps. But when I knelt down and picked one up, I saw that they were covered in handwriting. The ink was faded, smeared in places, but it was still legible, still clear. The words felt wrong. They were not words meant for me. They were words meant for someone else, someone who had been here before, someone who had written them over and over again, as if trying to reach through time, to warn whoever might stumble upon this room. Don't open the door. I froze. The air in the room grew heavy, like the walls were closing in. The flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw something, a shape, a form, standing in the far corner, just beyond the light's reach. I turned quickly, the room spinning around me, but nothing was there. The door closed behind me, and the whispers returned. I ran. I didn't look back. When I made it back upstairs, the house was silent again, too silent. But the clock in the attic began to tick. Its sound wasn't just a ticking anymore. It was a pounding, relentless, echoing through the walls. And as I lay in bed, the words written on the paper floating in my mind, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone. Not in this house. Not in this world. And whatever was on the other side of that door, it wasn't finished with me. Let's start a new story. We'd been together for a few months, still in that heady phase where everything felt electric but slightly fragile, like the whole thing might shatter if we held on too tightly. One night, we were sitting on the porch of my old apartment, legs tangled up, a blanket draped over our shoulders against the October chill. The conversation had stalled into a quiet, comfortable silence, and we just stared up at the night sky, our breath misting in the air. She tilted her head back, looking at the full moon, and said, "You know, if you stare at it long enough, you can feel it looking back." I laughed because of course I did. She always said things like that, half serious, half whimsy, like she was testing if I'd follow her into the strange little world she carried in her head. "Looking back," I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah," she said, turning to me with that soft, knowing smile of hers. Like it's saying, "Hey, don't forget. I've been here the whole time." I didn't know how to respond, so I just leaned into her, resting my head against hers. We sat like that for a while, the moon hanging above us like a silent witness. And when she finally stood to leave, she pointed at it again. "Let's make a deal," she said. "What kind of deal?" "Whenever the moon is full, no matter where we are or what we're doing, we stop and look at it. Just for a moment. We promise to share it." I smiled, thinking it was just another one of her dreamy ideas. But something in the way she said it, so earnest, so unshakably certain, made me nod. "Okay, deal." At the time, I didn't think much of it. But a month later, on a random Tuesday night, my phone buzzed. It was a photo of the moon, a little blurry, but unmistakably full, glowing in the night sky. Below it, her message read, "You looking?" "I am." I stepped out onto the porch, phone in hand, and looked up. The moon was so bright it lit up the trees in pale silver. And for a moment, I felt it. The pull, the quiet connection between her and me and this ancient, glowing thing that had existed long before either of us. From then on, it became a ritual. Every month, when the moon was full, we'd text or call, or, if we were lucky, find ourselves together under its light. Sometimes we'd make a big deal out of it, driving to the nearest hill or beach just to get the best view. Other times, it was simpler. Her standing outside her office, me on my balcony, miles apart, but joined by the same sliver of sky. The moon started marking our time together. There was the moon we saw from the park where we had our first fight, sitting on a bench in tense silence until she pointed up and said, "Even when we're mad, it's still there." There was the moon we shared from opposite coasts when she had to fly out for work, both of us on the phone, staring at the same light, making dumb jokes about werewolves and cheese. There was the moon we almost missed when the power went out in our apartment, and we spent hours lighting candles and boiling water on the camping stove. We'd been so focused on the darkness that we forgot to look up, but when we did, we saw it. Huge and golden, framed perfectly in the kitchen window. One year, during the dead of winter, we drove up to the mountains to watch a supermoon. We hadn't planned ahead, and when we got there, the road was icy, the wind sharp enough to steal our breath. But we parked, wrapped ourselves in every blanket we could find, and lay on the hood of the car. The moon felt impossibly close, like it was leaning down just for us, and for hours, we said nothing, just lay there together in its light. The ritual never faltered, even as life grew heavier. When her job moved her 3 states away, the moon became our constant, the thing we could always count on. Some months, we'd send long, poetic messages, trying to outdo each other in how we described it. A silver coin tossed into the well of the sky, or a glowing eye that sees everything but says nothing. Other months, it was just a quick, simple look-up text. Even after the distance ended and we found ourselves back under the same roof, we kept the tradition alive. The moon became our anchor, our way of saying, "Hey, I see you. I'm here." And then one night it was gone. We'd been busy, work, errands, the usual chaos. And by the time I remembered, the sky was hidden behind thick, gray clouds. She was already asleep, and for the first time, I felt the absence of it, like a thread that had quietly held us together was missing. But the next morning, as I poured my coffee, I saw a note taped to the fridge. The moon was there. It always is. Don't worry, I looked for both of us. That's the thing about rituals. They don't always need to be perfect. Sometimes it's not about the act itself, but the intention behind it. The quiet promise that no matter what happens, no matter how messy or unpredictable life gets, you'll keep showing up. Years later, when I tell people about us, I don't talk about the big milestones. I talk about the moon, about how we build a love that revolved around something so simple, so eternal, that even now, when I look up and see it hanging in the sky, I feel her there, like a whisper in the night. You looking? I am. What about you? What rituals tie your love to the stars? Let's start a new story. When I was 12, the neighborhood pool closed for good. The sign outside still read Northwood Community Pool in faded blue letters, but the padlock on the gate told the real story. It wasn't sudden. Attendance had been dropping for years. The vending machines were always empty, and the last lifeguard quit in August without bothering to turn in their whistle. But for us kids, it felt like a betrayal. The pool wasn't just a place to swim. It was where summer happened. The chain-link fence was supposed to keep us out, but it didn't. You couldn't stop kids with bolt cutters and too much free time. By the second week of summer, the pool had become ours. Not officially, of course, but in the way abandoned places always seem to belong to whoever claims them first. The water was green by then, murky and choked with leaves, but we didn't care. We weren't there to swim. The real draw was the dive tower. It was the tallest thing in the neighborhood, 3 stories of rusting metal and chipped paint, with a wobbly ladder that rattled when you climbed it. From the top, you could see everything. The grid of cul-de-sacs, the rows of ranch houses, the parking lot where the ice cream truck parked on Saturdays. It felt like standing at the edge of the world. That summer, the tower became our kingdom. It started as a dare. Joey, who always had more confidence than brains, climbed to the top and yelled, "Jump or you're chicken." None of us actually jumped, of course. The water was a stagnant swamp by then, and besides, everyone knew about the drain at the bottom of the pool, the one that sucked people under if you got too close. Joey swore it was just a rumor, but nobody wanted to test it. Instead, the tower became something else. We'd climb it every day, bringing flashlights and snacks, and whatever junk we found lying around. One day, Wendy hauled up an old boombox, and we spent the afternoon blasting mixtapes and throwing paper airplanes at each other. Another time, we tied a plastic milk crate to a rope and used it to haul up our supplies. Mostly cans of Coke and a half-melted box of Pop-Tarts. The tower wasn't just a tower anymore. It was a fortress, a treehouse, a pirate ship. And then, one day, we found the door. It was Joey who noticed it first. He was sitting on the platform, legs dangling over the edge, when he pointed at a hatch set into the base of the tower. It was small, maybe 2 feet across, with a rusted metal handle. None of us had seen it before, but to be fair, we'd never really looked. "What do you think's inside?" Joey asked, grinning like he already knew the answer. "Probably nothing," Wendy said, but her voice wavered. I didn't say anything. Something about the door felt wrong. It wasn't the rust or the way it seemed too small for the tower. It was the fact that it was locked from the inside. "Let's open it," Joey said, already climbing down the ladder. We followed him reluctantly, our feet scraping against the metal rungs. When we reached the bottom, he was already pulling at the handle, grunting with the effort. The door didn't budge. "Help me," he said, waving us over. I didn't want to. The closer I got to the door, the more wrong it felt. The air around it was colder, for one thing, and it smelled like damp earth, like the way the basement smelled after a storm. But Wendy was already helping Joey, and I didn't want to be the only one hanging back. So I grabbed the edge of the door and pulled. It opened. The smell hit us first, a sharp, metallic tang, like blood or old pennies. The inside of the hatch was pitch black, but the air coming out of it felt alive. It wasn't wind, exactly, but it moved in a way that made my skin crawl, like fingers brushing the back of my neck. Wendy leaned in, shining her flashlight into the darkness. The beam cut through the black, revealing a narrow shaft that dropped straight down. The walls were lined with old pipes, some of them leaking water that dripped in slow, steady beats. At the bottom, maybe 10 feet down, was a puddle. "That's it?" Joey asked, sounding disappointed. Wendy didn't answer. She was staring at something on the wall, marks scratched into the rusted surface, faint but unmistakable. They looked like letters, though I couldn't tell what they said. "I think," she started, but before she could finish, Joey grabbed a rock and dropped it into the hole. It hit the puddle with a splash. For a moment, everything was still, and then the water moved. It wasn't a ripple. It wasn't the kind of disturbance you'd expect from a falling rock. The water churned, swirling like something alive. And then we heard it, the hum, low and deep, like a faraway engine. But it wasn't coming from the water. It was coming from the pipes. "What the hell is that?" When he whispered. "I don't know," Joey said, though for the first time, he sounded nervous. We stared at the hatch for what felt like forever, none of us saying anything. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the metal, through the ground beneath our feet. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. We slammed the hatch shut and ran. We didn't go back to the tower after that. At first, Joey made excuses. He was busy, he had chores, his mom wouldn't let him out. Winnie stopped talking about it altogether, which was weird because Winnie never stopped talking about anything. And me? I pretended it didn't bother me, but I started avoiding the woods, taking the long way around just to keep from seeing the fence. The pool sat empty for the rest of the summer. By fall, they tore it down, the tower went with it, and eventually so did the memories almost. Sometimes, though, I still dream about that hatch, about the water moving, about the hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Sometimes I wake up feeling like I can still hear it, faint and far away, just on the edge of hearing. What do you think we found down there? Or better yet, what do you think found us? Let's start a new story. There's a hill in my hometown that doesn't show up on any maps. No trails lead to it, no signs point the way, and if you asked a dozen locals about it, 11 of them would look at you like you'd sprouted a second head. But it's there. I know because I've been to it, and it only appears when you need it most. The first time I stumbled across it, I was 15. I was walking home from school after the worst day I'd had up until that point. It wasn't just one thing either. It was everything. Bad grades, an argument with a friend, a teacher who decided I was the perfect target for sarcastic comments in front of the whole class. I didn't want to go home yet, so I wandered aimlessly through the town, past the quiet streets and the familiar shops, until I found myself in an unfamiliar place. The sky had turned an uneasy gray, the kind that threatens rain but never follows through, and the air smelled faintly of damp earth. I don't know what made me notice the path. It was barely a path at all, just a faint indentation in the grass that led toward a hill I'd never seen before. Something about it felt wrong. Not wrong in a dangerous way, but wrong in the way you feel when you remember putting your keys on the counter and then find them in your pocket. Like the world had quietly rearranged itself, and no one had bothered to tell me. I followed the path without meaning to, my feet moving as if they had decided for me. The hill wasn't steep, but the climb felt longer than it should have, and when I reached the top, the world below looked different. Not changed exactly, but distant, as though I was seeing it through glass. The wind was stronger up there, carrying whispers I couldn't quite make out, and in the center of the hill stood a single tree. It was massive, its branches twisting into shapes that didn't seem entirely possible, and at its base was a small, weathered bench. I sat down without thinking. My whole body ached, not from the climb, but from the weight of the day, and sitting there felt like letting go of something I hadn't realized I was holding. The view was stunning, a patchwork of green and gold fields stretching out to the horizon. With the town, I thought I knew, nestled at the center. I could see everything from up there. The school, my house, the park where I used to play when I was a kid. It all looked so small. I don't know how long I sat there before I noticed the box. It was tucked beneath the bench, almost hidden by the roots of a tree, but once I saw it, I couldn't look away. It was small, made of dark wood, with intricate carvings that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. There was no lock, just a latch that clicked softly when I opened it. Inside were scraps of paper, folded and worn, each one covered in writing. Some were faded, the ink smudged and barely legible, while others looked fresh, the words still sharp and clear. I picked one at random, unfolding it carefully. The handwriting was neat but hurried, the letters slanting as though the writer had been desperate to get the words out. I don't know what to do. Every choice feels wrong, and I'm so tired of pretending I have it all figured out. If anyone finds this, please tell me I'm not alone. I set it down, my hands trembling, and picked up another. Today was the first good day I've had in weeks. I sat by the river and watched the sun set. And for a moment, everything felt okay. I hope whoever reads this finds a moment like that too. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, each one filled with someone's thoughts, fears, and hopes. Some were short and simple, others long and winding, but all of them felt raw and honest in a way I wasn't used to. It was like holding pieces of people's souls, fragments of their lives that they'd left behind. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I pulled out a pen from my backpack and tore a page from my notebook. My hands shook as I started to write, the words spilling out before I could second-guess them. I feel invisible most days, like no one sees me, even when I'm screaming inside. But sitting here, I feel seen. I don't know why, and I don't know if it matters, but it helps. Thank you. I folded the paper and placed it in the box, tucking it among the others. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the tree, the box, the endless horizon. And then, as suddenly as I'd found it, the hill began to fade. The wind softened, the colors dimmed, and the world shifted back to the one I knew. When I stood up, the hill was gone. I didn't tell anyone about it. Who would believe me? But over the years, whenever life felt too heavy to carry, I'd find myself wandering, searching for the path without knowing if it would appear again. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. But when it did, I always climbed the hill, sat on the bench, and read the words left behind by others who had found it. And I always left a piece of myself behind, folded neatly and tucked into the box. I don't know what the hill is or why it appears, but I think it finds people who need it, even if they don't realize it yet. It's been years since I last saw it, but I still think about it sometimes, especially when the world feels overwhelming. I wonder if someone else is sitting on that bench now, reading my words and leaving their own behind. So, here's my question. Have you ever stumbled across something that felt like it wasn't meant to exist, but for you in that moment, it did? Something that changed you, even if you couldn't explain how or why? If you have, I'd love to hear about it. Let's start a new story. It started with a smell, not the kind you'd notice right away, but something faint and peculiar. Warm cedar, a hint of cloves, and the dusty sweetness of forgotten places. I caught it as I walked home one evening, threading my way through a part of the city I didn't usually visit. It wasn't much of a route, just cracked sidewalks and shuttered shops, but the smell lingered, tugging at me like the ghost of a memory I couldn't quite pin down. And then I saw it. A thin column of smoke curling from the chimney of a shop wedged awkwardly between two towering apartment buildings. It was a squat little structure, its roof sagging slightly, its windows glowing a deep amber. Above the door hung a wooden sign shaped like an open hand, palm outstretched, with words etched into the wood. The cartographer of missing places. I froze. The words seemed to vibrate, resonating with something inside me. I didn't need maps, and I didn't believe in omens, but my feet betrayed me. Before I could think better of it, I pushed open the door. The first thing I noticed was the air, warmer, thicker, almost alive. The second was the map. It was massive, covering an entire wall, its edges curling like parchment that had lived through centuries. But it wasn't a map of the world, or at least not one I recognized. The shapes were too fluid, the colors too vibrant. Some parts shimmered as though made of water, while others pulsed faintly like they had their own heartbeat. Scattered across its surface were glowing points of light, tiny as pinpricks, each one flickering as though it had something urgent to say. First time a voice said behind me. I turned to see an old man sitting at a desk piled high with papers, compasses, and tools that looked more like instruments of alchemy than cartography. He had eyes like polished stones, dark, reflective, and full of hidden depth. A thin cigar hung from the corner of his mouth, its smoke curling lazily upward to join the room's strange cedar clove scent. I suppose so, I stammered. He smiled, revealing slightly crooked teeth. Everyone's a first-timer. No one finds this place twice unless they need to. What is this? I asked, nodding toward the map. It's yours, he said simply. Mine. He leaned back, puffing on the cigar. Not the whole thing, of course. Just the pieces that belong to you. I didn't understand. The map was too big, too alien, too alive. I stepped closer, drawn to the nearest glowing point. When I touched it, the light flared, and suddenly I was somewhere else. Not figuratively, literally. The shop, the old man, the map, everything was gone. I was standing on a cobblestone street bathed in golden light. Around me were half-timbered houses with flower boxes spilling over with red and yellow blooms. The air smelled of rain-soaked earth and fresh bread, and a clock tower chimed somewhere in the distance. It took me a moment to realize I'd been here before. Not recently, years ago, when I was 12, on a family trip to a tiny village in Germany. It was the place where I'd spent a summer evening chasing fireflies with a local girl whose name I'd never caught. We'd laughed until our sides hurt, trading nonsense words and hand gestures to communicate. It was a memory I hadn't thought of in years, but standing there, it felt as vivid as if it had just happened. And then, just as suddenly, I was back in the shop, my hand still on the map. The old man was watching me, his expression unreadable. What? How did I stammered, my heart racing. You revisited a piece of yourself, he said. This map doesn't show where you are. It shows where you've been, or rather the parts of where you've been that stayed behind. I stared at him, trying to process his words. Stayed behind? He nodded. Not all of us leave places whole. Sometimes, pieces of us stick to the places we've been, like shadows or echoes. That's what this map tracks. I looked at the map again, at the dozens of glowing points scattered across its surface. These are all mine? Every one, he said. Something tightened in my chest, a mixture of awe and unease. What happens if I touch another one? He smiled faintly. Only one way to find out. I hesitated, then reached for another glowing point. This time, the light was cooler, almost blue, and when it engulfed me, I felt an ache in my chest. I was standing in the back row of a high school auditorium, watching my 16-year-old self play the piano during a school talent show. The song was flawed, my tempo off, my fingers stumbling over the keys, but there was a bittersweet pride in it. It was the last time I performed in public before giving up music altogether. The scene dissolved, and I was back in the shop, my throat tight. This is overwhelming, I said. The old man shrugged. Memories often are. But why show me this? I asked. Why now? Because you're ready, he said, his voice softer. Ready to gather what you've left behind. To stitch yourself back together. I didn't fully understand, but I couldn't tear myself away from the map. I touched point after point, each one pulling me into a different fragment of my life. A park bench where I'd written my first short story, a hospital corridor where I'd paced, waiting for news about my father, a carnival where I'd kissed someone for the first time. Some memories were joyful, others achingly painful, but all of them were mine. When I finally stepped back, the map seemed dimmer, as if I'd drained some of its light. The old man was still watching me, his expression somewhere between kind and amused. "What happens now?" I asked. "That's up to you," he said, standing and placing a small brass compass in my hand. Its needle spun wildly for a moment before settling, pointing not north but forward. "Where does it lead?" I asked. "Not where," he said. "When? The places you've left behind will wait. The compass only points toward what's next." I left the shop feeling lighter, as though the missing pieces of me had found their way back home. The streets outside looked the same, but the air felt sharper, clearer, filled with the promise of somewhere I hadn't yet been. Have you ever felt like parts of you were scattered across the world, waiting for you to find them again? Let's start a new story. The first time I met the woman with the silver eyes, I thought I was hallucinating. It was late, later than I should have been out, but I'd taken the long route home, driving through empty streets lined with old trees whose branches looked like clawing fingers in the twilight. The car radio was static, my headlights barely cutting through the fog that rolled in thick from the bay. There wasn't a soul on the road except me, and that's when I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the road, where the streetlight barely reached, her figure illuminated only by the dull glow of my headlights. Her dress, a flowing white thing that looked too delicate for the cold, wet air, moved as if it were alive, like it was part of the fog flowing with it. Her skin was pale, almost unnaturally so, and her hair shimmered like threads of moonlight, hanging loose around her shoulders. But it wasn't her appearance that stopped me. It was her eyes. They were silver, pure silver, like liquid mercury, like mirrors that reflected nothing. They didn't blink. They didn't even move when I slammed on the brakes and the car jerked to a halt in front of her. "Are you okay?" I asked, cracking the window. Her gaze didn't shift. For a long moment, she didn't respond. Then she tilted her head slightly, as if considering me. "I'm lost," she said, her voice soft, as though it were carried on the wind itself. I was confused. "Lost? This is a dead-end road." She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that unsettles you, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes, the kind that doesn't belong on a human face. "Not lost in that way. I'm looking for someone." I didn't know what to say. My brain was scrambling for a reason, some logical explanation, but it was like my thoughts couldn't piece themselves together properly. The fog seemed to close in tighter around her, and I could feel the temperature drop several degrees in a matter of seconds. "You shouldn't be out here alone," I said, trying to sound reassuring. She didn't answer. Instead, she just turned slowly and began walking away from the car, her feet not quite touching the ground. The sound of her footsteps, soft, like the rustle of dry leaves, echoed in the air. I should have driven away. I should have, but something about her, about the way the fog clung to her, made me feel rooted to the spot. I watched as she disappeared into the mist, her form swallowed by the darkness. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the empty road. My heart was beating fast, my hands still gripping the steering wheel. I tried to start the car again, but the engine sputtered and died. I turned the key once, twice, nothing. That's when I heard the voice. "You should have followed me." It was quiet, a whisper in my ear. But it wasn't in my ear. It came from all around me, the sound wrapping itself around my thoughts, pressing into my skull like a vice. I snapped the car door open, stepping out onto the cold asphalt. But there was nothing, just fog, stretching endlessly into the distance. My breath came in short, uneven gasps as I fumbled with my phone to call for a tow truck, but the screen was frozen, the signal completely dead. I turned in a slow circle, trying to get a sense of where I was, but all I saw was thick, impenetrable fog. That's when I felt it, eyes on me. I don't know how I knew, but I felt the weight of them, like they were burning into my back. I didn't look at first. I couldn't. But slowly, very slowly, I turned around. She was there. She was standing in front of the car again, as if she'd never moved. But this time, her silver eyes weren't empty. They were filled with something ancient, something cold. Her face was no longer serene. Now it was twisted, like a mask cracking beneath the weight of a forgotten emotion. And then the voice came again, this time louder, clearer. "You've been waiting for me." I froze, my blood running cold. I wanted to speak, to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. Her presence was suffocating, pressing in on all sides. "You have no idea who I am, do you?" she said, stepping closer, her movements fluid and unnatural. "No idea what I've been searching for. No idea why I'm here." I took a step back, bumping into the car. I tried to say something, anything, but the words stuck in my throat. She tilted her head, her silver eyes narrowing. "Do you want to know?" Without thinking, I nodded. Her smile returned, but this time it was sharp, like a blade slicing through the air. "You've seen me before, haven't you? In your dreams, in your memories. The only difference is you never saw me. Not until now." I felt the ground shift beneath my feet, as if the earth itself was bending. The fog grew thicker, swirling in tight spirals around her, and the air grew colder, too cold, like it was leaking in from another world. The world I knew felt wrong. I tried to pull away, but my body didn't move. My feet were glued to the ground. She reached out a hand, and for the briefest moment, I saw it. The truth. Her face, her silver eyes, were nothing but a mask. Beneath it was something else. Something impossibly old, with skin like stone, eyes like endless night, and a presence that made my very soul tremble. It wasn't her true face that haunted me, though. It was the knowledge that I had seen it before. In my dreams, in my childhood, in places I couldn't remember. "You've always known," the voice echoed inside my skull. "You just didn't know how to remember." The world cracked open. When I woke up, I was in my car again, the engine purring steadily beneath me. The fog was gone, the streetlights casting a soft, comforting glow. I looked around, half expecting to see her standing there, watching me. But there was nothing, just a quiet road, a night that felt too normal, too calm. But I knew she'd be waiting for me again, because we'd met before, and we would meet again. Let's start a new story. The train car was empty, except for a woman who sat 2 seats away from me, holding a glass jar. The kind you'd use to store pickles or jam, only this one was filled with fireflies. Dozens of them, glowing faintly in the dim light, their tiny bodies pulsing like slow, steady heartbeats. The jar didn't have a lid. Instead, the fireflies flew up to the rim, hovered for a moment as if testing the air, and then settled back down again. They didn't escape, though they could have. They just stayed content to circle each other in their quiet dance. I tried not to stare, but it was impossible not to. Who brings a jar of fireflies onto a train? The woman noticed me looking and smiled, a small, knowing smile that felt like she had been waiting for me to ask. So I did. "Are they yours?" I gestured vaguely at the jar, as though the word fireflies might not cover it. She tilted her head, considering the question. "They're not mine," she said, her voice soft but clear. "They're borrowed." "Borrowed?" She nodded, holding the jar up to the flickering fluorescent light above us. The fireflies glowed brighter for a moment, their golden light spilling across her hands. "They belong to places," she said. "Fields, forests, riverbanks. But sometimes they let me carry them, just for a little while." I couldn't tell if she was joking. Her expression was calm, serene, like she was stating an obvious fact. "Why do they let you carry them?" "To remind people," she said simply. "Of what?" "That even the smallest lights can find each other in the dark." The train jolted, the wheels clattering loudly against the tracks, and for a moment, the fireflies inside the jar scattered, their tiny forms darting in all directions before settling back into their rhythm. "What happens when you're done borrowing them?" I asked. "I let them go," she said. "Back where they came from. I only ever take them for a little while." The train slowed, and the automated voice announced the next stop. The woman shifted in her seat, cradling the jar closer to her chest. I wanted to ask more, where she'd come from, where she was going, how someone even borrows fireflies, but the words tangled in my throat. She stood as the train came to a halt, her long coat swishing around her ankles as she made her way to the door. Before stepping off, she turned to look at me one last time. "If you ever find yourself in the dark," she said, "look for the light that's looking for you." And then she was gone, disappearing into the night. I sat there for a long time, staring at the space she'd left behind. The train doors closed, and the car jolted forward again, but the words lingered, circling my thoughts like the fireflies in her jar. Look for the light that's looking for you. It wasn't until a few weeks later that I understood what she meant. I was walking through the park near my apartment, the kind of summer evening where the air feels heavy with the promise of a storm. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving the world in that strange in-between light when I saw them, fireflies. They blinked on and off in the tall grass, their tiny bodies flickering like Morse code. I hadn't seen fireflies in years, not since I was a kid, and for a moment, I just stood there, mesmerized. Then I thought of the woman on the train. Without really knowing why, I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, cupping my hand around it to dim the beam. I held it out toward the grass, feeling a little ridiculous, and waited. At first, nothing happened. The fireflies continued their dance, indifferent to my tiny offering of light. But then, one by one, they began to drift closer. A few settled on the rim of my flashlight, their bodies glowing faintly in response. I laughed, a quiet sound that felt almost like a release, and sat down in the grass. For the next hour, I watched them, this constellation of small, living stars. They didn't belong to me, not really, but for that moment, it felt like they'd chosen to be near me. When I finally got up to leave, I turned off the flashlight and whispered, "Thank you," to the fireflies. They blinked back at me, their light fading as I walked away. Now, whenever I feel lost or stuck or swallowed by the dark, I think about that woman and her jar of borrowed fireflies. I think about how even the smallest lights can find each other, how they flicker and dance and remind us that the darkness is never complete. And sometimes when the night feels especially heavy, I walk back to the park with my flashlight just to see if they're still there. They always are. So now I wonder, what's the smallest light you've ever found in the dark? Something so small you almost missed it, but it changed everything once you noticed? Or better yet, have you ever been someone else's firefly, glowing when they needed it most? Let's start a new story. I woke up on the wrong side of the bed. Not figuratively, but literally. The bed had shifted during the night, and when I sat up, I found myself staring at a completely new room. There were no windows. There were no walls, either. Just an endless stretch of soft blue light that hummed like distant waves against the shore. The floor was a mirror, shiny, perfect, and I could see my reflection, but it wasn't me. It was someone else. She was me, or at least, she looked like me, but her eyes were wide open in a way that mine hadn't been in years, like she had just seen something that would change her forever. Her hair was tangled in strange patterns, like something had been drawing symbols into it while I slept. She stared at me for a long time, and I stared back, but neither of us said anything. I wasn't sure which of us was the dream. I reached out toward her, and as I did, the floor, the mirror, began to ripple like water. The reflection buckled under my hand, then split into 2, 3, 4. Each time I touched it, another version of me bloomed out of the surface, like flowers pushing their way through cracks in the sidewalk. The woman I'd seen first remained the same, unmoving, but the others, we began to move. We all stretched, like we were waking up from a long sleep, all in different ways. Some of us rubbed our eyes, others jumped to our feet, some stretched, and one of me even yawned and grinned as though I was in on a joke only she understood. "Hello," said one of my reflections. "This is awkward, isn't it?" I started, but my voice was lost. My lips weren't moving. Another version of me answered, her mouth miming my words. The reflections started to speak in unison, as if rehearsing lines from a play I hadn't been told about. "It's not your fault," they said. "Don't worry," another one added. "We've all been here before." I felt something shift in my chest, a a gentle pressure that was both uncomfortable and oddly familiar. The room, if it could even be called a room, began to pulse like a heartbeat, and I had the distinct feeling that I wasn't alone, that I was being watched or felt. I couldn't tell which. It was like the space around me had a presence, a living thing. I stepped back, unsure of what was happening. I wanted to leave. I wanted to scream, but none of that made sense in a room that had no doors, no corners, no direction except down. And then the question hit me with a sudden sharpness that made everything go still. Where do you think you're going? I froze. I hadn't heard the voice. I hadn't heard anyone speak, and yet I felt the words wrapped around me like a warm blanket. They weren't spoken aloud. They were in me somehow, a thought, but not my thought, a push toward something. It wasn't the reflections who spoke this time. It was the room, or whatever the room had become. I swallowed. I'm not sure, I said aloud, even though I knew my lips hadn't moved. I don't know where I am. Ah, the voice responded, and it felt both amused and disappointed, like an old friend who knows exactly how this will play out. You're in the middle of it. The beginning, the middle, and the end. The space between choices. That word echoed in my mind, choices. My heart stuttered. Choices? I echoed. And this time, my reflection, the one with the tangled hair, smiled. Everyone has them, right? She said. But what if there's no right choice? What if everything you've ever done, every path you've taken, has already led you here, to this moment? What if everything you could have done was waiting for you, in the air around you, waiting for you to choose again? I could feel my breath catch. The air thickened, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. Another reflection, the one in the corner, tilted her head, her eyes bright with something like nostalgia. You know it's true, don't you? She said, as if she'd known me forever. All those moments you left behind, the things you didn't say, the doors you didn't open, the people you never told you loved them, the roads you didn't walk. They're all here now, ready to choose. Ready to choose? I repeated. Choose what? Choose what comes next, they said. Or choose nothing at all. It's always been your choice. We're just here to remind you. The reflections, we began to move toward me, but not in a way that felt like me. It felt like they were living inside me, pulling me from the inside out, like they were guiding me toward something. Something new. Each version of me shimmered, each one pulling me in a different direction, offering 1,000 different possibilities. I reached out, but as I did, the mirror beneath me rippled again, and the floor turned into a vast, starry expanse, an infinite sky. The stars blinked like they were waiting for me to do something, to say something, to choose. The reflections were still there, but they had multiplied. I could see them standing on the edges of the stars, floating just outside the reaches of my perception. They all held something in their hands. A key, a map, a book, a candle, a stone. This is how it happens. One of the reflections, this one with dark eyes, said, You stand on the precipice, and you choose how you move. There's no wrong path. Not really. Just the paths you haven't walked yet. I wanted to understand. I needed to understand. But the more I looked at the stars, the more I felt like they were looking at me, waiting. But where do I go? I whispered. The reflection with silver eyes smiled. It's not about where you go, she said, and her voice echoed in the vastness. It's about how you choose to go. Suddenly, everything was silent. The stars, the voices, the reflections, all of it stood still, as if holding their breath. The moment stretched. The stillness became heavy. I reached out again, my hand trembling as I grasped for the nearest reflection, for the nearest door, the nearest path. But instead of pulling me into another life, it pulled me inward. The stars swirled around me, and suddenly, I was the reflection. I was the choice, the moment, the path. I wasn't choosing anything at all. I was the choice. Every road I'd never taken, every word I'd never said, every step I'd hesitated to take, all of it was already here, inside me, alive. And then in the heart of it, I felt it, the real question. Where do you think you are going? The voice asked, gently this time. I took a deep breath, knowing I could answer it at last. Wherever I choose, I said. The stars flickered once, and the silence turned into music. and I was the one singing it. Let's start a new story. I was walking home from the late shift at the diner, the streets as quiet as a hell breath. My town wasn't much, just a scattering of houses, a gas station, and a main street where nothing ever happened. The kind of place you could leave for 20 years and come back to find it exactly the same. I'd walked this road 100 times before, but that night, something felt different. The stars weren't where they were supposed to be. At first, I thought it was my eyes playing tricks on me. A few of the constellations I knew, Orion, the Big Dipper, seemed to drift slightly as I stared at them. I rubbed my eyes, blamed exhaustion, and kept walking. But as I turned on a pine street, I froze. The stars had rearranged themselves into a perfect circle. It wasn't subtle, either. The circle hovered above the horizon, huge and luminous, its edges faintly rippling as though it were a reflection on water. I felt an electric buzz in the air, a vibration in my chest like the hum of a faraway engine. Every instinct told me to keep walking, to pretend I hadn't seen anything, but my legs wouldn't move. And then the circle blinked. It wasn't like a flash or a beam of light. It blinked like a single massive eye opening for the first time. The buzz grew louder, and before I could think, a thin beam of light shot down from the center of the circle, striking the ground in front of me. The pavement hissed where it hit, and in its place, something began to form. It was a box, small, smooth, and silver, no bigger than a shoebox, but shimmering with an otherworldly glow. My first thought was to run. Whatever this was, it wasn't meant for me. But my curiosity betrayed me. I stepped forward, drawn to it despite every logical part of my brain screaming to turn back. The box was cool to the touch, lighter than it looked. As I picked it up, the beam of light vanished, and the stars returned to their usual chaos, the circle dissolving into the night sky. The hum faded, leaving only the sound of my own unsteady breathing. There was no latch, no hinges, no visible way to open it. But as I turned it over in my hands, a faint symbol appeared on its surface, a spiral etched in white, glowing softly. Before I could examine it further, the box began to hum. The vibrations tickled my palms, and a voice, clear, calm, and utterly unplaceable, spoke. "Will you keep it, or will you open it?" I almost dropped the thing. The voice wasn't in my ears. It was in my head, as if the box had bypassed sound entirely. "What is this?" I asked aloud, my voice shaky. "A question," the voice replied, "and an answer." I didn't know what that meant, but the weight of the box seemed to increase in my hands, as though urging me to decide. My heart raced. I had no reason to trust it, no reason to open something that had fallen out of a blinking star. But the idea of putting it down felt wrong, like walking away from something I'd regret forever. "Fine," I said, mostly to myself. "Let's see what's inside." The spiral glowed brighter, and the box unfolded, not with the mechanical precision of a hinge, but like a flower blooming. Its sides peeled back, revealing an interior that was somehow much larger than its exterior. And inside, there was nothing. No, not nothing. The kind of nothing that wasn't empty, but waiting. A deep, infinite void, shimmering faintly like the surface of an oil slick. As I stared, the voice spoke again. "Step in." I laughed out loud, the sound sharp in the quiet street. "Step in? Are you kidding me?" "Step in," it repeated, as calm as before. The void seemed to ripple slightly, as though something beneath its surface was moving. My instinct screamed at me to put the box down, to walk away, to let this be someone else's problem. But there was that pull again, that inexplicable feeling that this moment wasn't random, that it was waiting for me. I took a breath, set the box on the ground, and stepped in. The world folded. It wasn't like falling or flying or anything I'd ever felt. It was like being stretched and compressed simultaneously, like moving through every possible version of myself at once. And then, just as suddenly, I was standing on solid ground. Except it wasn't ground. I was in a vast expanse of light, the air shimmering like glass catching the sun. Beneath my feet was a surface that felt solid but didn't look it. An endless, translucent plane that reflected everything around me. In the distance, I saw shapes moving. Towering structures made of shifting patterns, creatures with impossible forms, and rivers of light flowing upward. A figure approached me, their form fluid and constantly changing. Human one moment, something entirely alien the next. Their face was a kaleidoscope of features, as though they were borrowing pieces from every person I'd ever known. "You've answered the call," they said, their voice layered with echoes. "Few do. What is this place?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "This is the interstice," they said, the space between the known and the possible. I stared at them, trying to wrap my head around the words. "Why am I here?" They tilted their head, studying me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "You were chosen because you looked up," they said simply, "because you saw what most ignore." The figure extended a hand, and suddenly the box was in their grasp, though I didn't remember giving it to them. They opened it again, and this time, it wasn't empty. Inside was a single, glowing thread, pulsing with light. "This is your thread," they said. "Your potential. You can weave it into the fabric of this place, shape it into something new, or you can return to your world, unchanged." "What happens if I weave it?" I asked, unsure if I wanted to know. They smiled, a strange and flickering expression. "Then you create something that will ripple through all that is and all that could be. But every creation requires a cost." I stared at the thread, its light pulsing faintly. The air around me seemed to hold its breath, waiting for my decision. And then, slowly, I reached for it. Let's start a new story. When I woke up, I was sitting at a table in the middle of an infinite field of stars. The stars weren't in the sky. They were on the table, floating just above its smooth surface, shimmering softly, winking in and out as though they were alive. Each one pulsed gently, like the beat of a heart. The chair beneath me was warm, almost alive itself, shifting slightly to cradle my body as I adjusted my position. Across from me sat a person, or something like a person. They were made of glass, their translucent form refracting the light of the stars on the table, splitting it into shifting rainbows. Their face was featureless, yet expressive. When they leaned forward, the faint hum of their movement vibrated through the air. Their voice, when they spoke, was a melody I couldn't pin down, familiar, yet impossible to place. "You've been chosen," they said, their tone gentle but final. "For what?" I asked, my voice sounding small in this vast, luminous void. "To play the game of choices," they replied, gesturing to the stars. "The threads of your life gathered here. Every path you've ever walked, every path you've left behind, and every path you've yet to tread." I stared at the table, the glowing stars shifting in complex patterns. Some clustered together, swirling in tight spirals. Others drifted to the edges, fading faintly. "What do you mean? My life is just this." "No," they said, and though they had no face, I could feel the weight of their gaze. "This is everything, every possibility, every choice you've made, might make or could never make. And now, you must choose." I looked up sharply. "Choose what?" The glass figure raised a hand, and the stars on the table froze, each one suspended in perfect stillness. "One," they said, "one thread to keep, one life to live, the others will scatter." My chest tightened, but I'm already living a life. "Yes," they said softly, "but not the only one. You have been given a rare opportunity to see it all, to decide." The table shimmered again, and the stars rearranged themselves, forming a pattern that resolved into a scene. It hovered above the table like a tiny, luminous diorama, a version of me, living in a quiet, sunlit town. I ran a small bookstore, my days filled with the comforting rhythm of words and the scent of old paper. The image flickered, showing me laughing with customers, sipping coffee on the front steps, watching seasons pass in peaceful cycles. "That is one," the figure said, "a life of steadiness, of warmth." The stars shifted again, the bookstore dissolving into a new image. This time, I saw myself on a stage, speaking to a massive crowd. My voice was steady, my words lighting up faces in the audience. The scene flickered, and I was traveling across the world, meeting people, making connections, building something larger than myself. The air in this version was charged with energy, each moment electric and alive. Another, they said, a life of impact, of fire. The stars shimmered once more, and a new image emerged. In this one, I stood alone on a mountainside surrounded by towering peaks. I was painting with a feverish intensity, colors swirling on the canvas. The scene shifted again to a quiet cabin where I sat by a roaring fire, lost in thought. This life was introspective, creative, deeply personal, a retreat into the self, a world built of solitude and expression, a life of creation, of introspection. The figure waved their hand, and the images faded, the stars scattering once more. There are countless others, they said. Each thread is a life you could live, but the table can only hold so many at once. You may explore, if you wish, before choosing. I sat back, my head spinning. If I choose one, the others vanish? Not vanish, they said, tilting their head. They will remain echoes in the universe, possibilities rippling outward. But for you, they will be gone, forever. The weight of it pressed down on me, the vastness of the decision. I reached out instinctively, brushing my fingers against one of the stars. Instantly, a flood of images filled my mind. A version of myself as a parent, sitting in a cozy living room with a child leaning against my shoulder, reading a bedtime story. It was simple, but the love in that moment was palpable, a steady warmth that wrapped around me like a blanket. I pulled my hand back, my chest tight. What if I make the wrong choice? There is no wrong choice, the figure said gently. Only the one you live. But how do I know? I asked, my voice cracking. How do I know which one is right for me? You don't, they replied, their tone patient. Not fully. That is the nature of the game. But the thread you choose will shape you, and you will shape it. There is no right, only the living. I stared at the table, the infinite stars swirling before me. Each one called to me in a different way. Each one a life I could see myself living, a part of me that could be real. My hand hovered over the table, indecisive, trembling. What happens if I don't choose? I whispered. The figure leaned closer, their glassy form refracting the light of the stars. Then all the threads unravel. You will drift untethered, a ghost of possibility. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. The images of the bookstore, the stage, the mountains, the quiet living room, all flashed through my mind. Each life seemed vivid, alive, pulling me in different directions. But beneath the weight of the decision, I felt something else, a quiet certainty, buried deep. I opened my eyes and reached for one of the stars. My fingers closed around it, and the light flared, engulfing the table, the room, the figure. For a moment, I was everything and nothing, the stars burning inside me, their echoes fading into the vastness of the universe. And then I was back. I was sitting on a wooden bench in a park, the sunlight warm on my face. The world was still, ordinary real. In my chest, I felt the faint hum of the star I had chosen, its rhythm now my own. I didn't know exactly what lay ahead, but I felt it, the thread winding forward, pulling me toward a life that was mine to live. If you were at the table, staring at all the stars, would you have the courage to choose? And if so, which life would you reach for? Let's start a new story. Not the fancy, artisan kind you might find in some overhyped cafe, but just a plain black cup from my kitchen. I had been meaning to go to the store for a new bag of beans, but life had a way of getting in the way. So there I was, drinking what could only be described as desperate coffee. You know the kind. The kind you make with whatever's left in the jar, which is always somehow both too weak and too bitter at the same time. I had this moment mid-sip where I realized I wasn't really drinking it. It wasn't so much that I didn't want it, it was more like I wasn't even there. My hands were wrapped around the mug, but my mind was elsewhere, ticking through the usual inventory of things I should be doing, things I've forgotten, and things I'll probably never get around to. It was like I was on autopilot, just floating through another morning, waiting for something to wake me up. But then the cup cracked. It wasn't a big crack, just a small line running from the rim, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. And I wasn't looking for it, but I saw it. My fingers stilled around the mug, and for some reason, I couldn't stop staring at it. The crack seemed so out of place, so sudden and final, as if the mug had decided, no more pretending, I'm done. I felt something shift inside me. I don't know how else to explain it. That little crack, so inconspicuous, felt like a tiny, jagged mirror reflecting everything I had been ignoring. It wasn't about the mug. It was about me. I wasn't broken, not exactly, but I'd been living like I was. I had spent so much time trying to patch things up, pretending everything was fine, when really, there were cracks everywhere, waiting to be noticed. I put the mug down slowly, like it might break if I moved too fast. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do next. I stood there in the kitchen, staring at the crack in the cup like it had some profound wisdom to offer me. But of course it didn't. It was just a crack. Just a mug. Or maybe not. I thought about it all day. This ridiculous moment with a cracked cup. How small, how insignificant, how human. It's funny how we're taught to hide the cracks, to pretend they don't exist. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how much beauty there was in them. How much truth. Because the cracks are the story. They're the things that tell you how the mug was made, what it's been through, where it's been dropped and glued back together. They're the moments we carry, the things we try to hide because we're afraid they make us look fragile. By the time I got home that evening, I was a little different. Not in a I've had an epiphany kind of way. More like in the way you wake up from a long nap and realize you feel better, even if you can't explain why. I grabbed the cracked mug off the counter, and instead of tossing it, I poured myself another cup of coffee. I didn't try to fix it. I didn't even care that it was cracked anymore. It wasn't perfect, but neither was I. I had no idea what I was doing. I still don't. But sometimes, when you're just going through the motions, something small, the tiniest little crack, can make you stop. It can make you look at things in a new light. I ended up keeping that mug. I still use it every morning. Actually, I kind of love it now. The crack doesn't make it any less useful. In fact, it makes it more me. Imperfect, worn, a little chipped around the edges, but still holding coffee. Still doing its job. So, here's the thing. When was the last time you let yourself be okay with your own cracks? What would happen if you let them show? If you stopped pretending everything had to be perfect? I think there's something beautiful in those imperfections, but I'd love to hear what you think. Does a crack always... Let's start a new story. At first, it was just the usual groggy awareness, tangled sheets, the half-formed memory of a dream that made no sense but probably involved a lot of flying and a sentient toaster. But as I sat up and rubbed my face, I noticed something strange. Everything around me felt alive. Not in a supernatural way, but like a movie set where the props were secretly actors, waiting for their cue. I shuffled to the bathroom, half-heartedly avoiding a pile of clothes that had accumulated in the corner, and reached for my toothbrush. The moment my fingers touched it, I heard a soft voice. "Oh, we're doing this again," the toothbrush sighed. I blinked and looked around. "What?" "You grab me, you scrub your teeth, you throw me back in the cup without a second thought." It continued, sounding incredibly put upon. "How about a little gratitude? I'm the one keeping your mouth from becoming an uninhabitable wasteland." I paused, toothbrush suspended in midair. "You talk." "Of course I talk. Do you think I'm some kind of glorified stick? I have feelings, you know." I didn't know how to respond. I just kept brushing, hoping that would somehow break the awkward silence. The toothpaste tube, sensing my discomfort, joined in. "I've been squeezed so much. I'm practically a performance art piece at this point. Every time you pinch me, I lose a little bit of my soul." I spit into the sink, still processing what was happening. "Okay, all right, fine. You both have feelings. I get it." I looked at the mirror, hoping to see something familiar, like my own exhausted face. But instead, the reflection looked back at me with a knowing smirk. "You've got morning hair," the mirror observed. "I tell you to brush it, but honestly, I think it's giving you character." "Seriously?" I raised an eyebrow. "You're welcome," it replied with a wink. "Embrace the chaos. Let the world see your inner mess." I was beginning to wonder if maybe I had hit my head during sleep. But before I could contemplate that further, The floor creaked behind me, and I turned to find the rug glaring at me. "Don't even think about it," the rug warned, looking both exhausted and exasperated. "I can see where this is going. You're going to walk all over me, aren't you?" I took a cautious step, but the rug didn't relent. "Yep, there it is. Every time. First, you ignore me when I need to be cleaned. Then you track dirt on me like I'm some sort of doormat. Literally." I sighed. "Sorry, I didn't realize you were so sensitive." The rug wasn't done. "Sensitive? No. But I've got standards. You can at least try to respect them." I gingerly stepped over it, just to avoid any further conflict. The coffee machine, usually my ally in this chaotic world, was conspicuously quiet. I walked over to it, and with a pressing of buttons, it sputtered to life. But instead of the usual pleasant gurgling of coffee brewing, it let out a deep, resigned sigh. "Do you really need me today?" it grumbled. "I mean, you've got a lot of other options. The pantry's filled with tea, for crying out loud." "Coffee," I muttered, rubbing my temples. "I need coffee." "Fine," the machine said with exaggerated annoyance. "But don't come crying to me when you're jittery and unproductive. You've been relying on me for years. Ever thought about a detox?" I didn't dignify it with an answer. The coffee poured, and for a moment, the world seemed to calm. That was until the sugar jar chimed in from across the counter. "Just so you know, I don't always need to be the sweet one," it said. "I have more dimensions than just sweet. Why not try me in your savory recipes? You're limiting my potential. Maybe tomorrow," I muttered, deciding it was better not to engage. At this point, I was fairly sure I was losing my mind, but somehow the whole thing felt oddly pleasant, like I was living in an absurd sitcom where the characters were everything around me, and they didn't even care to pretend they were normal. As I sat down to my now lukewarm coffee, the chair under me let out an exaggerated groan. "You really think you can just plop down on me like that without proper appreciation?" "Appreciation?" I muttered into my mug. "Yes," the chair huffed. "I'm providing support, both physical and emotional. You sit on me when you're tired, when you're stressed, and you never acknowledge my tireless work." I chuckled. "I'm sorry, chair. You've been through a lot, I know." "Damn right I have," the chair said, almost smug. "But hey, you've got a good posture, so I'll give you a pass. For now." I took a sip of my coffee, wondering how much more of this I could take. But the moment I glanced out the window, the world outside started up its own routine of unsolicited commentary. The mailbox, perched by the curb, groaned, its metal creaking in the morning light. Every day, same thing. I'm just a glorified inbox. No thanks, I'm not opening myself to more junk mail today. It's too much. I had to laugh at that. "Oh, I feel you, mailbox," I said out loud. The car parked in front of my house, not wanting to be left out, honked irritably, as if to announce its displeasure with my lack of enthusiasm for it. "I'm not your valet," it honked again. "You think I like sitting here all day, waiting for you to finally take me out for a spin? I got wheels. I could be zooming around, but no." All right, I said, holding up my hands in mock surrender. "You want a road trip? Let's go for a spin." The car went silent, clearly satisfied. But before I could get on with my day, I noticed that the sidewalk leading to my front door was also murmuring under its breath. "Don't even think about it. You'll be back to me in a few hours, covered in dirt, and I'll be the one who has to bear it. I should be a privilege, not a carpet for your shoes." "I get it," I muttered and quickly hurried inside. The day had barely begun, and I was already wondering if I was living in some strange parallel universe where everything, from my coffee cup to my driveway, had opinions. But instead of driving me insane, it was strangely comforting. The world had come to life in a way that made me realize just how much I take for granted. Each object, each small corner of my home had its own voice, its own personality, and it felt like I was finally in tune with the invisible hum of the universe around me. So, I'll ask you, if the things around you could talk, your couch, your shoes, your fridge, would you welcome the noise, or would you run for the hills? And more importantly, would you ever want to go back to a world where they stayed silent? Let's start a new story. Not a noise exactly, but a vibration in the air, low and steady like a sound too old to hear, but impossible to ignore. I'd been walking home from the late shift at the diner. The town already asleep, its streets silent under the weight of midnight. The hum started when I passed the old orchard at the edge of town, the one people said had been cursed for years. No one explained how or why. Small towns love their mysteries, but they keep their secrets even closer. The orchard looked different that night. It wasn't just the moonlight or the fog rolling low over the ground. It was the trees. They weren't still. Their branches swayed, not with the wind, but with a rhythm, like they were listening to the hum too. I stood there on the road, my breath clouding the air, feeling an unshakable pull. Logic told me to keep walking. My feet disagreed. The path into the orchard was overgrown, but it didn't feel abandoned. It felt tended to in some strange, invisible way. The hum grew, louder the deeper I went, thrumming in my chest like a second heartbeat. The fog thickened, twisting between the trees, and the air smelled like something sharp and green, a mix of fresh leaves and metal. The ground underfoot was soft, spongy, like stepping on moss. I don't know how far I walked. Time felt strange there, stretched and folded in ways that didn't make sense. And then I saw it, a clearing in the center of the orchard. In that clearing stood a door. No frame, no house, just the door. It was tall and impossibly black, its surface polished like obsidian, reflecting the moonlight in jagged patterns. There was no handle, no hinges, no sign of how it stayed upright. It shouldn't have been there. It couldn't have been there. And yet it was. The hum pulsed louder as I stepped closer, the air thick and buzzing, alive with something I couldn't name. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't. I didn't even try. There was a strange comfort in the hum, like it wasn't just sound, but language, something trying to speak, to call. When I reached the door, the air around it shimmered, rippling like heat on asphalt. I raised my hand without thinking, my fingers brushing the cool, smooth surface. The moment I touched it, everything stopped. The hum, the sway of the trees, even the fog. It all went still, as if the entire orchard were holding its breath. Then, with a sound like ice cracking, the door began to open. The world beyond the door wasn't dark, but it wasn't light either. It was something else, a space without edges, stretching infinitely, filled with the same low hum, but layered now, like chords in a song. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt my hand tremble against the door. I should have been terrified. Instead, I felt invited. And then it stepped through. The figure wasn't human, not really. It was tall and thin, its shape shifting like smoke caught in a draft. Its surface shimmered with colors that didn't belong to this world. Colors I couldn't name, colors that moved as if they had a purpose of their own. Its face, if you could call it that, was blank, smooth, and featureless, but I could feel it watching me. "Why did you come here?" it asked. The voice wasn't a voice. It was the hum, bending itself into words, vibrating through the air and into my bones. "I don't know," I whispered, though it wasn't entirely true. Something had pulled me here. The orchard, the hum, the door. It had all been waiting. The figure tilted its head, or at least that's what it seemed like. "You are not lost," it said, "but you are searching." "What am I searching for?" I asked, my voice barely audible. It didn't answer. Instead, it stepped closer, its form rippling as if it were made of liquid light. When it reached me, it raised a hand, or something like a hand, and pressed it against my chest. The contact was cold and warm at the same time, a sensation so overwhelming I couldn't breathe. Then the world changed. I saw things. Not memories, but echoes. Places I'd never been. A city with spires that glowed like embers. A river of glass winding through a forest of stone. And stars. So many stars. Burning brighter than anything I'd ever seen. Forming shapes and patterns that felt older than time. And within those stars, a sound, a song. The hum, but vast now. Endless. Weaving through everything like a thread holding the universe together. When I came back to myself, I was lying in the clearing, staring up at the moon. The door was gone. The figure was gone. The hum was gone. The orchard was silent. I sat up, my head spinning, my chest aching where the figure had touched me. The world felt sharper, brighter, like I was seeing it for the first time. The trees no longer swayed. The air was no longer heavy. It was just an orchard now, quiet and unremarkable, as if nothing had happened. But something had. I walked back to the road, my legs shaky, my mind reeling. The hum was gone, but its memory lingered, vibrating faintly in the back of my mind. When I reached my house, I looked at myself in the mirror, half expecting to see a stranger. But it was still me, just me, with the faintest trace of something unexplainable in my eyes. I don't know what I found in the orchard that night. Or maybe it found me. All I know is that sometimes late at night, when the world is quiet and the air is still, I hear it again. The hum, low and steady, calling me back to a door that no longer exists. Have you ever felt like the world was waiting? Let's start a new story. I've been thinking a lot lately about how weird it is to be alive in 2024. Like, when I really stop and examine it, I'm living in a world where you can have a conversation with an AI in your pocket that knows your coffee order better than your closest friends, while simultaneously witnessing human beings still trying to figure out how to microwave a frozen pizza without burning it. We've come so far in some ways, but we're still baffled by other things. For example, take the world of online dating. You can meet someone you've never seen before, swipe left or right with your thumb, and potentially spend hours scrolling through carefully curated photos of their hiking trips and cappuccinos. You almost feel like you know them, but really, you're just a few sentences away from discovering whether they believe pineapple belongs on pizza. And yet, somehow, that's the new normal. The idea of meeting a stranger at a coffee shop, looking into their eyes, and having an honest-to-goodness conversation feels almost quaint. It's like the world decided, hey, let's make romance efficient. As if love and efficiency go hand in hand. And yet, despite the overwhelming digital landscape, I'm constantly surrounded by reminders that technology is, at its core, trying its very best to imitate the messiness of human connection. Take social media, for instance. The way we craft our identities online is an art form of its own. We use filters to soften imperfections, captions to enhance humor, and hashtags to manufacture belonging. We post pictures of our breakfasts like they're cultural statements, as if the world needed to know about the avocado toast we just made. Look, here I am, living my best life. We shout into the void, while in reality, we're probably standing in front of our bathroom mirror, wondering why we haven't gotten around to making that dentist appointment yet. It's funny because when I was younger, I thought adulthood would involve something more substantial, like, I don't know, owning a house with a real garden and maybe some classic furniture. Instead, I own a collection of indoor plants that I've almost killed twice. And don't even get me started on the furniture. My couch is a half-decent imitation of a couch. It's comfortable enough, but also looks like something you'd find in a show about minimalist apartments that don't actually exist in real life. But still, I treat it like a throne. I sink into it after work, scrolling through endless TikToks about how to live your best life while wearing comfy clothes and drinking iced matcha lattes. It's like a cycle of self-care and self-doubt that I never signed up for, but here I am, living it. And don't get me wrong, it's not that the idea of modern living isn't great. We're all more connected than ever before, right? You can FaceTime someone in another country, binge-watch entire seasons of a show in one sitting, or order groceries from your couch while never leaving the comfort of your pajamas. We've got gadgets that know what we want before we even know it. I can't tell you how many times I've received an email saying, "We think you'd love this book," and I've thought, how did they know? It's a little eerie and kind of amazing, but also slightly unsettling. The strangest thing is how technology has sped up so many things, but at the same time, we're all still trying to slow down. Like, think about how we've taken something as mundane as breakfast and turned it into an event. A few decades ago, a bowl of cereal was just a bowl of cereal. Now, it's an Instagram-worthy masterpiece. I've seen people go to great lengths to make their morning smoothies aesthetically pleasing. There are color-coordinated fruits, perfectly measured protein powders, and of course, an artistic swirl of spirulina. At some point, making a smoothie became a performance art. It's a strange fusion of I'm so chill and, but wait, let me just check the lighting. This, of course, leads me to think about all the other absurd rituals we've developed, especially around self-care. Have you ever noticed how self-care has morphed into something that's very complicated? At some point, buying a $70 candle became a sign of sophistication. Oh, you're burning eucalyptus-scented wax? Wow, you must be really centered. In reality, I'm just hoping I don't burn my house down with it. There are days when I can't even manage to remember to put the dishes away, but I've got a drawer full of face masks and soul-refreshing bath salts. It's like we found a way to sell peace of mind, one $15 bath bomb at a time. But here's the thing, I get it. I do. It's all part of the absurd dance we do to feel like we got it together. Even when we know we're one TikTok away from getting sucked into a rabbit hole about conspiracy theories involving the moon landing. We're just trying to live well, manage our anxiety, and maybe find a little joy in the chaos. And when I think about it that way, the whole thing is kind of beautiful. The truth is, we're all just trying to figure out how to exist in a world that's moving faster than we can process it. The trick, I think, is learning to laugh at the ridiculousness of it all. Because if you don't laugh, what else do you do when you realize that you've spent an hour watching a video of a pug eating a watermelon and you're not even sorry about it? So, in the spirit of embracing the absurd, I'll leave you with this. What's your most delightfully ridiculous moment of modern life? Is it something you caught yourself doing, like buying the avocado, even though you knew you didn't need it? Or is it one of those moments when technology completely outsmarted you? I'm all ears. Tell me your stories. I'll be here, probably still trying to find the perfect filter for my breakfast smoothie. Let's start a new story. The woman at the counter didn't look up when I walked into the cafe. There was a slight tremor in the air, like a question hanging unasked between us, but she didn't seem interested in asking it. Instead, she focused on the chipped mug in her hands, running her thumb along the crack in the glaze as if the damage meant something. I had been here once before, though I couldn't quite remember when. The place had a tendency to fade in and out of my life like an unfinished thought. I was used to it now, the way it lurked at the edge of the day, always waiting for me to stumble across it again. It wasn't like other cafes. There was no sign outside, no grand opening or fancy decor. It existed like a secret hidden in plain sight. The walls were crowded with old books and faded paintings that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. The chairs were mismatched, the tables uneven, but it felt more like a sanctuary than a cafe. And the coffee, well, it tasted like memories, warm and a little bitter, like something you're not supposed to forget. I sat at a table by the window, my usual spot. There was a fog creeping across the street, the kind that made everything look like it was suspended in time. The city beyond felt distant, like it wasn't quite real. I was pulling out my notebook when I heard her voice. "You came back." I looked up, startled. She was standing across from me, the woman behind the counter, the one who had never once acknowledged me until now. I didn't know how to respond. It was odd, how she said it, as if she expected me to have an answer, but I didn't. I didn't even remember how I had ended up here. I'm sorry, do I know you?" I asked, feeling the words slip from my mouth before I could stop them. She smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was a knowing smile, the kind someone gives when they've seen through all your layers and found something you didn't know was there. "You don't remember me," she said, "but you will." She turned and walked back to the counter, leaving me with the strange weight of her words hanging in the air. I couldn't shake the feeling that she knew me better than I knew myself. It wasn't a feeling of familiarity. It was deeper than that. Something about her presence, the way she held herself, felt like it had been stitched into the fabric of my life, even though I had no memory of it. Minutes, or maybe hours later, she returned with a steaming cup of coffee. The steam rose in thin tendrils, curling in a way that reminded me of something long forgotten. "Drink," she said. "It's time to wake up." The words hit me with a strange force. Time to wake up. It wasn't what I had expected. I thought I was awake already, but as I took the first sip, something in the back of my mind clicked. The taste was nothing like any coffee I had ever had before. It wasn't just the richness or the bitterness. It was something more. It tasted like the years I had spent running away from something, like the pieces of myself I had forgotten and buried beneath the surface. It tasted like the life I had never lived, the life that was waiting for me. I set the cup down, my hands trembling. "What is this place?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned against the counter, her eyes studying me as if she were measuring the distance between where I was and where I needed to be. "It's a place for people like you," she said softly. "People who forget. People who lose their way." You stared here, confused. People who forget? Lose their way? Her gaze softened, and for a moment, she almost looked sad. Yes, people who are running from themselves. I felt a shiver run through me, though I didn't know why. It was as if her words had opened a door inside me that I hadn't even known was there. The idea of running from myself. It didn't make sense, but at the same time it did. There were pieces of my life, memories, choices that I couldn't quite recall. They hung just out of reach, like fragments of a dream slipping away when you wake up. "Why am I here?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "What am I supposed to do?" The woman reached out and touched the chipped mug again, her fingers moving over the crack with a tenderness that made my chest tighten. "Everyone who comes here has a choice," she said. "You can stay here, in the fog, where time is slow and things fade. Or you can go back and face what you left behind. But know this, you can never have both." The weight of her words pressed down on me, a crushing reality I wasn't ready for. The thought of returning to a life I didn't fully remember, of confronting whatever I had left behind, was terrifying. But staying here, in the fog, seemed like a slow death, like surrendering to the emptiness. I stood up suddenly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I don't understand," I said. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do." She looked at me with those piercing eyes, as though she were seeing all the parts of me I had buried, the parts that were too afraid to face the truth. "You'll remember," she said simply. "When the time comes." I wanted to ask more questions, to demand an answer, but something stopped me. The air around us felt thick, like it was closing in on me, and for the first time in a long while I felt an overwhelming urge to leave. I grabbed my coat and ran out the door into the fog. The cafe seemed to melt behind me, as if it had never existed. The world beyond felt distant, like I was walking through someone else's dream. I walked for what felt like hours, the fog wrapping around me, blurring everything into indistinction. But with each step, I felt it, the pull of something forgotten, the quiet tug of a life I had left behind. And then, finally, I remembered. I remembered the reason I had come to this place, the reason I had been running. I had left because I was afraid of the person I had been, afraid of what I had done. But more than that, I had left because I was afraid of facing myself. And now, as the fog began to lift, I knew I was finally... Let's start a new story. I know. That sounds like a cliche, but it's true. There was a whisper, and it wasn't the usual trick of wind rustling through leaves or the hum of a distant conversation. It was a voice, clear and deliberate, as if someone had leaned in and spoken directly to my ear, just loud enough to make me question my own sanity. But when I turned around, no one was there. I'd been walking through the old park on the edge of town, the one with the crooked stone paths and benches worn smooth by years of weather. It was the kind of park most people avoided. People said it was haunted, but they never gave details. They just said it in passing, like an urban legend, like you were supposed to know what they meant without asking. I hadn't meant to go there, but my feet seemed to have a mind of their own. I had left the office late, feeling drained from an entire day of mindless emails and meaningless meetings. I didn't want to go home yet, didn't want to face the silence of my apartment. So my feet carried me here, to the place no one else dared to be. The whisper came just as I reached the old oak tree near the pond. It wasn't a sound I could explain, almost like someone calling my name, but faint, as though the voice was carried on the air like a half-forgotten dream. "Help me," it said. I froze. I had no idea what to do. The air felt heavier somehow, like it was pressing against my chest, suffocating me. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the park. Nothing. Not a soul in sight. The benches were empty, the path ahead winding into shadows where the streetlights didn't reach. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but that voice, something in it seemed so familiar. A tugging, aching sensation in my chest. It felt like a memory I couldn't place, or maybe one I had forgotten on purpose. I was about to turn around, leave the park, when something shifted. A glimmer, like a flicker of light or movement, but far too fast for my eyes to catch. Something in the bushes by the pond. Just a trick of the shadows, I told myself, but still, my legs moved without thinking, taking me toward the edge of the water. There, by the willow tree that draped its branches almost to the ground, was something unexpected. A small door. Not a building or a house. Just a door, standing there in the middle of the park, half hidden by the curtain of weeping branches. It looked ancient, the wood gnarled and worn with age. A brass handle gleamed under the pale light of the moon, beckoning me, though I didn't know what for. I reached for it before I could stop myself, my fingers closing around the cold metal. When I turned the handle, the door opened, but not to the park I had been standing in. Beyond the threshold, there was another world, a vast, rolling meadow stretching out under a sky that shimmered with stars I had never seen before. The grass was a soft blue, the air thick with the scent of something sweet, almost intoxicating. I stepped through, unsure of whether my mind was playing tricks on me or if this was something else entirely. The moment my foot touched the grass, a figure emerged from the horizon. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but as it came closer, I saw the shape of a woman. No, not a woman, but something older, a being that didn't belong in any world I had ever known. She wore a cloak woven from threads of twilight, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light, like twin stars that had fallen to earth. "Who are you?" I asked, though the question felt small and insignificant in the face of this presence. She stopped a few feet away, studying me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. Her voice was like the rustling of leaves on a quiet night. "I'm what you have forgotten." I opened my mouth to ask more, but before I could, she raised a hand, silencing me. "You don't need to speak. You already know." And she was right. I did know, but the knowledge was buried deep, hidden in the recesses of my mind, like something that had been locked away for too long. I had come here for a reason, I just couldn't remember what it was. "Help me," she said again, her words the same as before, but now they had meaning, a pleading, a desperation that rang louder than the whisper I had heard in the park. "Help me find the door." The door. I turned back to where I had come from, and there it was, the door standing on the edge of the meadow, though this time it was different. It shimmered like it was made of light, vibrating with energy, and I realized then that it wasn't just a door. It was a bridge, a threshold between worlds, between realities. The woman's eyes softened. "It's time," she said, almost as if she were reassuring herself more than me. "I have waited so long." I wasn't sure what to do. A part of me wanted to turn and run, to go back to the life I knew, the one where I was just a person, walking through days like everyone else. But another part, the part that had led me here, wanted to stay, wanted to know what lay on the other side of the door. "Will I ever return?" I asked, the question slipping from my mouth before I could stop it. The woman's gaze flickered. "Some doors only open once. The choice is yours." The words echoed in my mind as I stood there, caught between the two worlds, neither sure what would happen if I stepped through. Then, something strange happened. The door shifted, and I could see it, a world like my own, but different. The faces were familiar, yet foreign. The sky had a hue I couldn't quite place, and the air seemed to hum with an energy that felt both ancient and new. "Everything you seek is beyond this door," the woman whispered, her voice pulling at me like a tide. The decision was mine, a strange impulse, not unlike the one that had pulled me into the park in the first place, guided me forward. I took one step. The moment I crossed the threshold, everything changed. I was no longer in the meadow, no longer with the woman. I stood in a place that felt like home, but also a world I didn't recognize. Familiar faces surrounded me, but they were not the people I knew. They were me, different versions of myself, each one more fragmented and distant than the last. I saw the life I had lived, the choices I had made, and the paths I had left behind. And then I understood. I wasn't the only one searching for the door. We all were. Somewhere deep inside, I had always known that I wasn't alone in this journey, that I had more than one life to live, more than one choice to make. But it was the door, the choice, that had always remained hidden. The whisper, the woman, the meadow, they had all been guiding me toward this moment, toward the understanding that the life I thought I knew was only one part of the story. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of it all. The stars above felt closer now, their light reflecting in the strange world around me. And somewhere, just out of reach, I heard the faintest whisper. "Help me," it said. This time I knew exactly what it meant. Let's start a new story. I was on my usual walk to the bookstore, cutting through a narrow lane where the city folds in on itself. Alleys stacked with fire escapes, shop signs leaning like old friends, and a stray cat or two prowling through the leftovers of another day. The wind was sharp, pushing me forward when I saw it. A stretch of empty road lit up in waves as the traffic lights flickered obediently to their schedule. Red, yellow, green, over and over, without a car, bike, or pedestrian to command. For a moment, it felt like the lights were performing a ritual for their own amusement, like the city had an inner life it lived when no one was watching. I lingered longer than I should have, watching the pattern. A man passing by muttered something about daydreamers clogging up the sidewalk, and I snapped back in emotion, though the image of those lonely lights stayed with me. Around the corner, a group of teenagers was leaning against a graffiti-covered wall, their breath curling like smoke in the chilly air. One of them was sketching something on a folded piece of cardboard. The others were watching with rapt attention, their faces illuminated by the faint glow of a nearby neon sign. I slowed my steps, pretending to adjust my scarf so I could get a better look. The boy with the marker was drawing what appeared to be a dragon, but its wings were jagged, fractured, more lightning bolt than feather. The creature's eyes seemed to burn, even on cardboard. When he finished, the others erupted into cheers, and one of them took a photo with an ancient flip phone, like they were documenting something sacred. I kept walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just witnessed the birth of a myth. Further down the street, an old woman was sitting at a folding table outside a bodega, her hands busily knitting something from a spool of multicolored yarn. The table was covered with tiny knitted creatures, foxes, owls, whales, all perched in orderly rows, waiting for homes. She had no sign, no prices, just her and the quiet click of her needles. A man in a suit stopped and picked up a small yellow bird, holding it in his hands like it might flutter away. "How much?" he asked. The old woman didn't answer. She just smiled and gestured for him to take it. The man hesitated, then nodded and slipped the bird into his pocket, walking away without another word. I almost said something, almost asked her what she was doing, why she was giving her work away for free, but I didn't. There was a kind of stillness about her, like she existed outside of the rules of commerce, outside of time itself. Instead, I walked on, the tiny bird's yellow warmth lingering in my mind. The bookstore was a riot of color and chaos when I arrived, a sharp contrast to the quiet of the streets. Shelves sagged under the weight of used paperbacks, and the air smelled of old paper and something faintly citrusy. A man was flipping through a dog-eared atlas in the corner, his fingers tracing the edges of continents as if he were memorizing them. Nearby, a young woman sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by stacks of poetry books. She had a notebook open in front of her, scribbling furiously, her lips moving as if she were arguing with her own words. The shopkeeper, an older man with wild hair and a sweater that looked older than I was, noticed me hovering near the philosophy section. He gave me a knowing nod, then pointed toward a shelf tucked into the corner. "New arrivals," he said, his voice raspy but kind. "Found something strange in there yesterday." I followed his direction and found a thin, unmarked book. Its cover was plain, its spine cracked, but when I opened it, the pages were covered in handwriting. Not printed text, but actual ink, written by someone with looping, elegant penmanship. The words seemed to dance on the page, their meaning just out of reach, like poetry written in a language I almost understood. "Where did this come from?" I asked, turning to the shopkeeper. He shrugged. "It showed up in a box of donations. Nobody knows who wrote it. Thought you might like it." I wasn't sure why he thought that, I wasn't even sure I liked it, but I bought the book anyway. It felt like the kind of thing you don't leave behind, even if you don't understand why. On my way home, the city seemed softer, quieter. The streetlights still blinked their empty signals, but now it felt less mechanical, more like a secret rhythm I wasn't privy to. As I passed the alley where the teenagers had been, the cardboard dragon was gone. In its place, someone had painted a mural on the wall. The same jagged winged creature, now alive in bright colors, its eyes glowing with a fierce kind of joy. The old woman was gone too, her folding table packed up, but one of her knitted creatures, a tiny fox, was sitting on the curb, as though waiting for someone to pick it up. By the time I reached my apartment, I felt like the city had shifted around me, like I had walked through one layer of it and stumbled into another, deeper one. The plain book with its strange handwriting sat heavy in my bag, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been waiting for me. I opened it again that night, and for the first time, the words seemed to make sense. Not fully, not yet, but enough to feel like the beginning of something. So now I'm wondering, when was the last time you felt like the world was speaking to you in small, secret ways? And did you listen? Let's start a new story. It began with a crack in the pavement. At first glance, it was nothing special, just one of the countless fractures that spread like veins through the city's concrete skin. But this one was different. It wasn't the jagged, chaotic split of time and where. It was precise, unnaturally so, its edges smooth and sharp, like something deliberate had sliced through the ground. I might not have noticed it if it weren't for the faint glow seeping from the edges, a silvery light that shimmered like moonlight on water. I was walking home late, the streets empty, the air heavy with the kind of silence that makes your own footsteps sound unnaturally loud. My eyes caught the glimmer, and I stopped, standing over the crack with a mixture of curiosity and unease. Something about the light made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It wasn't warm or inviting. It felt cold, sharp, as though it could cut through me as easily as it had the pavement. For a moment, I considered stepping over it and continuing on my way. But then the light pulsed, just once, faint and rhythmic, like the beat of a distant heart. I crouched down, reaching out without realizing it, and brushed my fingers over the edge of the crack. It was warm, humming faintly against my skin. That's when the pavement shifted. It wasn't an earthquake, not the violent trembling of the ground. It was smoother, quieter, as if the world had simply exhaled. The crack widened, and before I could react, the ground beneath me gave way. There was no sensation of falling. One moment I was standing in the city, and the next I was somewhere else entirely. The world around me was unrecognizable, a vast expanse of endless twilight. The sky was a deep, swirling indigo, streaked with veins of light that pulsed faintly, echoing the rhythm I'd felt in the crack. The ground beneath my feet was smooth, glassy, reflecting the sky above like a perfect mirror. I could see my own reflection in it, but it was wrong. My face fractured into countless versions of itself, each one slightly different, their eyes watching me with a disquieting intensity. I took a step forward, the glass-like surface rippling underfoot, and as I moved, I noticed shapes emerging in the distance. Structures rose from the ground, towering spires that seemed to grow like living things, twisting and coiling into impossible forms. The air was alive with sound. Not music, not words, but something in between. It was a melody that felt ancient, yet familiar, resonating deep in my chest as though it had always been a part of me. The first figure appeared as I reached the edge of what might have been a path. It wasn't human, not exactly. Its body shimmered like the surface of the ground, its form shifting with every step, never settling on one shape for long. It turned toward me, and though it had no face, I felt it watching me. "You've come," it said, its voice soft but resonant, as though it spoke directly into my mind. "I didn't mean to," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't even know where I am." The figure tilted its head, a gesture that seemed both curious and amused. "You've always been here," it said. "You just didn't know how to see it." I wanted to argue, to ask what it meant, but before I could speak again, The figure extended an arm, or something like an arm, toward the sky. The veins of light above us pulsed in response, and suddenly, the air around me was alive with motion. Shapes began to form in the distance, swirling and shifting, until they solidified into what looked like doorways. Dozens of them, each one unique. Some were simple, wooden frames standing alone in the expanse. Others were intricate, carved from materials I couldn't name, glowing faintly with the same silvery light as the crack that had brought me here. "You must choose," the figure said, stepping aside to reveal the paths leading to the doors. "Choose what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it faded, dissolving into the air like mist. I was alone again, the path stretching out before me, the doors waiting in the distance. The melody in the air grew louder, more insistent, pulling me forward. Each step I took felt heavier, as though the ground itself resisted me, but I couldn't stop. The doors were calling me, their light growing brighter with every passing moment. When I reached them, I hesitated. Each door felt alive, vibrating with energy that I could feel in my bones. I didn't know what lay beyond any of them, but I knew, instinctively, that each one would lead to a different version of something, of somewhere, of me. I reached for the closest door, its surface smooth and cold under my hand, and as I turned the handle, the melody reached its crescendo. The world beyond the door was a blur of motion and color, a torrent of memories that weren't mine, but felt achingly familiar. I saw myself, or versions of myself, living lives I'd never known. One was a writer, hunched over a desk in a dimly lit room. Another stood on a mountaintop, staring out at a horizon painted in gold and crimson. Another was laughing, surrounded by faces I didn't recognize but felt I should have. Each version of me looked back, their eyes full of questions, as though they were as lost as I was. I stepped through, and the door vanished behind me. The world settled, the melody fading into a quiet hum that pulsed gently in the background. I was standing in a field now, the grass soft underfoot, the sky above clear and endless. In the distance, I saw a figure waiting, human this time, their silhouette familiar. As I approached, I realized it was one of the reflections I'd seen earlier, the one that had seemed to watch me with something like recognition. "You made your choice," they said, their voice echoing with the same melody I'd heard in the air. "I don't even know what I chose," I admitted. The figure smiled, a small, sad smile that felt like it carried the weight of lifetimes. "You chose to see," they said, "and that's enough." The world around me began to shift again, the field dissolving into light, and I felt myself being pulled backward, upward, as though the ground itself had let go of me. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the city, standing over the crack in the pavement. The glow was gone, and the street was as it had always been. But something was different. The air felt lighter, the shadows less oppressive, and in my pocket was a single shard of glass, smooth and cold, etched with veins of light that pulsed faintly, a reminder of the choice I'd made and the doors I'd left behind. Let's start a new story. At precisely 3:33 p.m. on a mundane Wednesday, every clock I passed stopped. Not slowed, not ticked irregularly. They stopped. My phone, the wall clock in the office, the ancient analog watch of the barista at the cafe. They all froze, locked in time, as though the concept of 3:33 had decided it was a perfectly acceptable end to the day. At first, I thought it was some bizarre coincidence, a glitch in the matrix, or maybe a prank involving a synchronized power surge. But then I noticed something else. No one else seemed to realize it. My coworkers continued typing away at their computers, sipping coffee, muttering about spreadsheets. The barista hummed to herself while she steamed milk. A toddler in a stroller clutched a dripping ice cream cone, her parents obliviously chatting about something or other. No one was concerned. No one even looked at the clocks. I should have ignored it. I should have gone back to my desk and resumed my own version of pretending to work. But something about it gnawed at me, the kind of thing you can't shake. So I did what any reasonable person wouldn't. I followed it. The first clue came when I returned to my desk. There, sitting where my phone should have been, was a postcard. I hadn't put it there. No one had been near my desk. It was an old-style postcard, the kind tourists might send from a kitschy roadside attraction, except this one was blank. No words, no address. Just a faded image of an old, crumbling lighthouse. I flipped it over, hoping for some kind of explanation, but all I found was a single line scrawled in messy handwriting. Time waits at the edge. It made no sense, and yet I couldn't stop thinking about it. The lighthouse on the postcard looked familiar, though I couldn't place it. Something about the image tugged at me, like a half-forgotten memory. By the time I left the office, the clocks were still frozen, and the world felt different. People moved normally, but their movements seemed disjointed, like I was watching a video with a frame missing here and there. Colors felt too sharp, edges too defined, and the air hummed faintly, like the static before a thunderstorm. That was when I made the choice. I decided to find the lighthouse. It didn't take long. As I stared at the postcard on the subway home, turning it over and over in my hands, a thought surfaced. I know this place. The faint outline of the rocky shore, the way the tower tilted ever so slightly, the dark clouds painted above it. I'd seen it before. It wasn't far. A small, abandoned town about an hour's drive from the city, perched on a cliff overlooking the ocean. I didn't know how I knew it, but the certainty settled over me like a heavy coat. By dusk, I was driving down a desolate road, the faint hiss of waves audible even through the closed windows of my car. The lighthouse came into view suddenly, towering over the edge of the cliff like an old sentinel. It was more decrepit than the postcard suggested, its paint peeling, the glass of its lantern cracked and fogged. But it was unmistakable, and at its base there was a door. The door wasn't part of the lighthouse. It was freestanding, positioned just a few feet in front of the structure, and it was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was massive, carved from what looked like polished obsidian, with intricate patterns etched into its surface, stars, spirals, lines that seemed to stretch into infinity. It was out of place, an alien object on an otherwise weather-beaten coast. I parked the car and stepped out. The air here was sharp, cold, filled with the smell of salt and stone. The door thrummed faintly, a deep vibration I could feel in my chest. As I approached, I noticed an inscription at the top, written in a language I didn't recognize. And yet somehow I understood it. Only the untethered may pass. My hand trembled as I reached out to touch it. The surface was smooth and cold, humming beneath my palm. The second I made contact, the world shifted. The cliffs, the ocean, the lighthouse, they all dissolved like mist, replaced by a vast, open void. The void wasn't empty. It stretched endlessly, filled with stars, millions of them, hanging impossibly close. Some were small, faint, barely glowing embers. Others were massive, their light pulsating with a rhythm that felt alive. Between them, threads of silver and gold stretched like a web, connecting each star to another. It was beautiful, breathtaking, and entirely wrong. "You've come," a voice said behind me. I turned to see someone or something. It wasn't human, though it wore the shape of one. Its form shimmered, constantly shifting between features, as though it couldn't decide which face it wanted to wear. Its eyes, though, were constant, black and infinite, filled with pinpricks of light like galaxies trapped in glass. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "The archive," it said. "The space between. Every moment, every choice, every thread of time. It is all here waiting." "Waiting for what?" "For you," it said simply. The figure stepped closer, extending its hand. In its palm was an object, a key, black and glinting like the door I'd passed through. "You stopped time?" it said. "You fractured the thread." "I didn't," I began, but it shook its head. "Unknowingly," it said, as though that clarified everything. "But now, you are here, and the question remains, will you mend it?" I looked past the figure, at the threads connecting the stars. Some pulsed faintly, as if struggling to hold together. Others were dark, severed, trailing into nothingness. My chest tightened. I didn't know what I was seeing, not fully, but I understood enough to feel the weight of it. "What happens if I don't?" I whispered. The figure tilted its head. Then the threads unravel. Slowly at first, then all at once. I stared at the key in its hand, the stars behind it flickering in patterns I couldn't decode. It felt like a test, though I didn't know the rules, the stakes, or even who was asking the question. But something inside me whispered, "Take it." So I did. The moment my fingers closed around the key, the void shuddered, the stars and threads spinning into a kaleidoscope of light. And then I was back, standing at the base of the lighthouse, the door gone, the world silent. The clocks worked again after that. But sometimes, late at night, I catch them hesitating. And I wonder if the key in my pocket, cool and heavy, might have something to say about it. Let's start a new story. The rain had started before I left the apartment. Just a quiet drizzle at first, the kind that whispers promises of a downpour, but never quite delivers. I didn't mind the rain. In fact, I kind of liked it, the way the city streets softened under the weight of it, how everything felt a little less sharp, a little more introspective. But the umbrella I had was one of those flimsy ones that flips at the slightest gust of wind, so I didn't expect to stay dry for long. I was on my way to meet Ellie. I say meet, but it wasn't really a first date. More like the third or fourth time we'd been in the same room together, but somehow, this one felt different. She was always funny, always quick with a sharp observation. But tonight there was something about her smile, something in the way she'd tilted her head when she texted me earlier. Like she was waiting for something to happen, something that hadn't yet arrived. We were meeting at the old arcade on the edge of town, the one no one really talks about anymore, the one where the machines still have the sticky glow of nostalgia and the smell of stale popcorn lingers in the air. It's a place that feels caught between two worlds. The one where the years of neon lights and clunky video games are frozen in time, and the one that's moving forward, where everything is streamlined and efficient and no one has time for such random indulgences. When I got there, she was already waiting by the door, leaning against the brick wall like she'd stepped out of some old movie, the collar of her jacket pulled up against the rain. She looked at me for a moment before she smiled, the kind of smile that makes you feel like you've been let in on a secret you didn't know you were missing. "Didn't think you'd show," she said, her voice still carrying the remnants of a laugh. "I was half expecting you to text and say I'm going to skip it. I've realized I'm actually just a cat person." I laughed, shaking my umbrella off and stepping into the warmth of the arcade. "I'm here, aren't I?" She raised an eyebrow, teasing, but I saw that little glint in her eyes that always came out when she was either about to do something mischievous or when she was holding a little bit of herself back. She looked at the row of machines with a strange fondness, like she was in a place that made sense to her in a way the rest of the world didn't. "I'm not going easy on you tonight," she said, with that mix of challenge and invitation that always left me wondering if she was going to pull out a hidden, fierce side of herself, or if this was all just another layer she wore, because it made her laugh to watch me try to figure her out. We started with the classics. Pac-Man, Street Fighter, one of those claw machines that's always rigged but still somehow manages to make you think, this time will be different. I watched her lean in close to the joystick as if she had a secret, like she knew exactly how the game would play out before the first coin hit. She destroyed me, again and again, except somehow, each victory made me more enthralled than frustrated. "All right," I said, after she beat me for what felt like the 100th time, "I think it's time we switch gears. What's your favorite game here? Something that actually challenges you." She glanced around and then walked over to a machine I'd passed 100 times but never really noticed. It was one of those old pinball machines, the kind with the metallic balls that clink and bounce around like they're on a mission of their own. "This," she said, "this is the one. It's got layers. It's not just about speed. It's about the rhythm." "Pinball's about rhythm?" I asked, skeptical. "Everything is about rhythm," she said. "Life, love, whatever. You just have to know when to push, when to pull back." I wasn't sure if she was talking about the game anymore, but I didn't interrupt. Instead, I stood behind her, watching her fingers work the flippers with practiced precision. The ball flew across the board, pinging off bumpers and targets, and she moved with it like it was an extension of herself. There was something almost hypnotic about it. How she seemed to be in tune with the machine, how every move was timed just right, how the world outside of this little arcade almost faded away, and all that was left was the flicker of lights and the rush of the game. When she finally stepped away, letting the ball fall, she turned to me with a grin that was half smug and half something else. something I couldn't place. "Your turn," she said, stepping aside with a flourish. "But no pressure. You just have to beat my score." I approached the machine, my fingers a little clumsy, my thoughts still wrapped around whatever it was she'd said about rhythm. And then, somewhere in the middle of the game, when the lights were flashing and the ball was flying too fast for me to track, I got it. There was something about the way you could let the ball guide you, the way you had to wait, poised between two actions. When you tried too hard to force something, it would always slip out of reach, but when you let go, when you just let the rhythm take over, that's when it clicked. I started hitting the targets, one after another, the flippers moving in perfect harmony, and somehow the ball stayed in play long enough for me to beat her score. Ellie watched, her face a mix of admiration and disbelief. And when I finally finished, I turned to her, a goofy grin on my face. "Is this how you feel when you actually beat someone at this game?" I asked, catching my breath. She tilted her head to the side, her smile softening. "Kind of. It's about knowing when to step back and let someone else have their moment, too." I raised an eyebrow. "So, you let me win?" She chuckled, shaking her head. "No, I just didn't want to win badly enough." There was a pause, and for the first time, it felt like something was hanging between us. Something unspoken, but palpable. "Why are we always so afraid of just letting go?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. "Of not trying so hard?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached over and flicked the machine back on, making the ball light up again, sending it into motion with a gentle nudge. She looked at me, her eyes steady, almost too knowing. "Because sometimes," she said, her voice soft, "we're afraid of finding something we didn't know we needed, something we can't control." I didn't know what to say because in that moment, it felt like she had cracked open something I didn't even know was closed. I watched her, and in the quiet after the noise of the game, I realized that this, whatever this was between us, felt like the rhythm I hadn't been able to find before. "So next time," I said, nudging her, "you're going down." She smiled, and for once, it didn't feel like a competition. "Next time, maybe we'll just play together." And I realized in that simple moment that together was exactly what I wanted all along. Have you ever shared a moment with someone where everything just clicked, and for once, it felt like you didn't have to force it? Let's start a new story. The first package arrived on a rainy Thursday, left on my porch without a sound. It was small, wrapped in brown paper, and tied with a piece of string so taut it looked like it might snap. There was no return address, only my name scrawled in dark ink across the top. Lucas. I didn't think much of it at first. I ordered things online constantly, books I never finished, gadgets I didn't need. Maybe I'd forgotten about this one. But when I opened it, there was no book, no gadget, nothing I could explain away. Inside the package was a watch. It was old, heavy and intricate, the kind of thing that seemed like it should be displayed in a museum instead of hidden in a cardboard box. The face was a swirl of copper and brass, with gears exposed beneath a glass dome. Tiny etchings ran along the edges, symbols I couldn't recognize, but couldn't stop looking at. There was a note folded beneath it, written on thick paper that smelled faintly of smoke. "Keep it close, win it often, and never let it stop." That was it. No explanation. No name. I turned the watch over in my hands, the weight of it unfamiliar, but oddly comforting. When I wound it, the gears sprang to life with a soft, rhythmic ticking, the hand spinning once before settling at exactly 3:13. I checked my phone. It was 8:47. That was the first time the watch made me uneasy. Still, I kept it. There was something about it, something compelling, like it wanted to be held, like it needed me. I wore it to work the next day, half hoping someone would recognize it, give me an excuse to laugh it off as a prank. But no one did. My coworkers barely noticed, their conversations looping endlessly about deadlines and the upcoming office trivia night. Except for Janet. She paused mid-sentence when she saw it, her eyes narrowing. "Where'd you get that?" "Someone left it on my porch," I said. "Why?" Her face tightened. "It looks familiar, that's all. Just be careful, okay?" "Be careful of what?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "Never mind." By the time I got home, I convinced myself she was just being weird. Janet always had a flair for the dramatic. But as I stepped into the house, the watch started ticking faster. Not louder, just faster, like the gears were racing to catch up with something I couldn't see. I pulled it off my wrist, holding it up to the light. The hands were spinning wildly now, faster and faster, until they stopped. 3:13. The exact moment the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, and for a second, all I could hear was the rain against the windows and the ticking of the watch. Then came the knocking. It was soft at first, almost polite, like someone didn't want to disturb me. But when I didn't move, it grew louder. I grabbed my phone, fumbling for the flashlight, and pointed it toward the front door. The knocking stopped. The door was open. Not wide open, just a crack. "Hello?" I called, my voice unsteady. No answer. I stepped forward, the floor creaking beneath me, and peeked outside. The porch was empty. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the streetlights casting long, distorted shadows across the wet pavement. When I closed the door, the watch started ticking again, slow and steady. That night, I couldn't sleep. The ticking seemed louder now, echoing in the corners of the room, syncing with the rhythm of my heartbeat. At 3:13 a.m., I woke to find the watch on my nightstand glowing faintly. The symbols etched into the edges pulsed with light, and for a moment, I thought I saw them move, rearranging themselves into patterns I couldn't understand. I didn't touch it. I couldn't. The next day, another package arrived. This one was smaller, wrapped in the same brown paper, tied with the same string. Inside was a slip of paper, nothing else. The watch chooses. Be ready. I thought about throwing it away, smashing it, doing anything to get it out of my life. But something stopped me. The thought of the watch leaving my hands made my stomach churn, like it was a part of me now, and letting it go would mean losing something vital. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. Lights flickered whenever I walked into a room. My reflection in the mirror didn't quite match my movements. Objects I swore I'd left in one place appeared somewhere else entirely. And always the watch ticked. Fast, slow, erratic, its rhythm seemed to change with my mood, my thoughts, my fears. Janet stopped me in the office again, her face pale. "Have you been winding it?" she asked. "Yes," I said, surprised by the desperation in her voice. "Don't stop," she whispered. "Whatever you do, don't stop." "What are you talking about?" She leaned in, her voice barely audible. "It doesn't just keep time, it keeps you." That night, I tried to take the watch off, but it wouldn't budge. The clasp was stuck, the metal warm against my skin. I wound it, as I always did, and watched the hand spin. 3:13. The power went out again. This time, the knocking wasn't on the door. It was on the walls, the windows, the floor beneath my feet. The watch began to glow, brighter than before, the symbols shifting rapidly, their light casting strange shadows across the room. And then I heard it, a voice, low and resonant, speaking in a language I didn't know but somehow understood. "Your time is borrowed. Return what you owe." The knocking stopped. The power returned. And the watch, its ticking steady once more, felt heavier than ever. I still don't know where it came from or why it chose me. But every night, at exactly 3:13, it reminds me, time isn't free. Let's start a new story. I woke up to a world stitched from someone else's imagination. The ceiling above my bed was gone, replaced by an endless quilt of shifting colors, reds bleeding into golds, blues unraveling into streaks of white. It was as if the sky had been turned inside out, spilling its guts of storms and stars in broad, messy strokes. A faint, rhythmic sound echoed all around me, the low, deliberate tick of a clock that wasn't anywhere I could see. When I stepped out of bed, the floor wasn't my floor. It was made of letters, thousands of them pressed together to form planks that bowed slightly under my weight. They shifted and rearranged themselves as I walked, spelling out words I didn't recognize, only to dissolve back into the texture of the floor when I looked too closely. I stumbled toward my window, but it wasn't a window anymore. It was a frame, floating in midair, holding a picture that flickered like an old film reel. It showed my street, but not as I'd left it. The houses were no longer houses. They had become living things, breathing softly as their roofs flexed and stretched. The streetlights were spindly figures, their bulbous heads tilted upward, emitting a faint, melancholic glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. Then the frame spoke. "You don't belong here yet," it said, its voice like a whisper carried on the back of the wind. I jumped, nearly losing my balance on the letterplank floor. "What do you mean, yet? Where am I?" The frame's picture flickered faster, scenes blurring together. A forest of glass trees, a cityscape where buildings folded in and out of themselves, an ocean filled with floating lanterns instead of waves. "You're in the unwritten," it said, "where everything goes before it becomes real." My heart thudded in my chest. "What does that mean?" "It means," the frame replied, "you're very, very early. Or very, very late. The timing is always tricky." Before I could press it further, the frame shattered. Not into glass, but into black feathers that scattered across the room, disappearing as soon as they touched the air. I turned back to my bed, thinking maybe this was all some vivid, strange dream and I could just sleep through it. But the bed was gone. In its place stood a door. The door was impossibly tall, its wood dark and smooth, as if it had been polished by 1,000 hands. A brass keyhole sat in the center, glowing faintly like an ember. Above it, carved in looping script, were the words, "What you could have been." I stared at it for a long moment. The words shifted slightly, flickering between languages I didn't know, but somehow understood. The sound of the ticking clock grew louder, as though daring me to move. I stepped forward, drawn by something I couldn't name, and placed my hand on the door. The wood was warm, pulsing faintly like it had a heartbeat of its own. It swung open without a sound. Beyond the door was everything. It wasn't a room or a hallway. It was an expanse, an endless canvas painted with moments that seemed to float in midair. I saw myself, over and over again, in 1,000 different scenarios. There I was as a child, standing at the edge of a swimming pool I was too afraid to jump into. There I was as a teenager, staring at an application I'd never submitted. There I was yesterday, hesitating before sending a message I wasn't brave enough to type. Each moment was suspended, glowing faintly, waiting for something or someone to breathe life into them. "You can take one," said a voice behind me. I turned to see a figure standing in the doorway. They wore a cloak made of pages, each one scrawled with sentences that shifted and changed as I watched. Their face was obscured by a mask, smooth and featureless, save for a single, bright line where the mouth should have been. "Take one what?" I asked, though I already knew. "A moment," they said, gesturing toward the floating scenes. "One you left behind, or one you never touched. They're all yours, after all." My chest tightened. "And what happens if I take one?" The figure tilted their head. "It becomes real. You step into it, live it, change everything that comes after." I looked back at the moments, my hands trembling. There were so many. Some I recognized immediately, their memories sharp and painful, like splinters that never worked their way out. Others felt distant, abstract, like they belonged to someone I'd almost been but never quite became. "And if I don't take one?" I asked. The figure's head tilted the other way. "Then they stay here, unwritten, waiting, but you'll leave with nothing more than what you came with." I turned back to the moments, my heart pounding. My younger self still stood at the edge of the pool, toes curling nervously against the concrete. In another scene, I was at a train station, watching someone I couldn't quite place step onto a train and disappear. In yet another, I was standing on a stage, bathed in light, holding a microphone I hadn't yet spoken into. I wanted to reach out, to grab one, to rewrite something, anything, but then I noticed a moment I hadn't seen before. It was small, almost imperceptible, tucked away in a corner. In it, I was sitting in my room, holding a pen poised above a blank page, my face furrowed in thought. I was still, unmoving, but the air around me was charged with possibility. "What's that one?" I asked, pointing. The figure looked at the moment, then back at me. "That," they said softly, "is the story you haven't written yet." I stared at it, something deep in my chest loosening. I didn't need to change the past or pluck a moment from the ether. I just needed to step forward, into the unknown, into the story that wasn't written yet, but could be. "I don't want to take anything," I said finally. The figure nodded, their pages rustling like a sigh. Then "Right," they said, "the next door is yours to make." And just like that, the moments dissolved into light. The ticking clock stopped. The world around me softened, blurred, until I found myself back in my bed. The ceiling was solid. The floor was still letters, but they were quiet now, resting beneath my feet like they were waiting for something. And in my hand was a pen. So here's my question for you. If you stood in a room filled with every moment you left behind and every story you hadn't written yet, which would you choose? Would you reach for the past or step forward into the possibility of everything you've yet to create? Let's start a new story. I should have listened to the warnings. I should have stayed far, far away from the woods. But I didn't because, well, that's what happens when you're young and too stupid to listen to reason. I grew up in a small town at the edge of the forest. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where you can walk to the grocery store without locking your doors, where the biggest drama is usually about the state of Mrs. Halstead's garden. But there was always one thing that nobody talked about: the woods. Now, the woods were huge. I'm talking miles of dark, twisting trees, thick vines, and uneven ground, the kind of forest that makes you feel small just looking at it. I played there as a kid, of course. We all did. But then, as you grow older, people start to warn you. They say things like, "Don't go in after dusk," or "Stay away from the old trail." There are stories about people getting lost and never coming back. And sure, I'd heard the stories, but like any young person itching for something to prove, I dismissed them as old superstition, silly fears meant to keep us safe. That was my mistake. It was a summer evening, the air thick and warm, when I decided to finally explore the woods properly. No friends, no distractions, just me and the trees. I'd heard rumors of an old abandoned cabin deep in the forest, long forgotten by everyone but the bravest or the most foolish, and I thought it was high time I saw it for myself. I packed a small backpack with water, snacks, and my phone, just in case. The first part of the trail was familiar enough. Tall trees, birds overhead, nothing sinister. But the further I went, the quieter it got. The usual chirping stopped. The wind slowed to a whisper. I felt like something was watching me, but I chalked it up to my own nerves. After all, what harm could a cabin in the woods do? As the trees grew denser, I came across something strange. A set of small, rusted iron posts, half buried in the dirt, like the remains of an old fence. I bent down to inspect them, but something about the sight made my skin crawl. The posts were arranged in a circle, almost like a boundary, a warning maybe? But I ignored it. I was close now. The cabin was near. When I finally found it, it wasn't what I expected. The cabin was small and crooked, barely more than a shack with crumbling stone steps leading up to a door that hung ajar. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The wood was darkened with rot, and the air around it felt thick with something ancient. But I wasn't scared. No, I was curious. So I stepped forward and pushed the door open. Inside, there was nothing. Just a dusty floor, a fireplace choked with debris, and a few broken pieces of furniture. Yet, as I moved deeper into the room, I felt an oppressive weight, like the air had thickened around me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Then I saw it. On the far wall, hidden behind a pile of fallen branches and rotting wood, was a symbol carved into the plaster. It looked ancient, like something from a time before written language. I moved closer, my breath coming quicker now. The lines of the symbol twisted and looped in ways that made my head ache if I stared at it too long. It was as if the symbol was alive, as though it shifted under my gaze, pulling me in. I couldn't tear my eyes away. And then I heard it, a low whisper, not in my ears, but in my mind. "Leave now." I froze. The voice was soft, like a secret too terrifying to be spoken aloud. But it wasn't my voice. It was older, much older. And suddenly, everything that had been fine, everything that had felt like a simple adventure, collapsed into the cold grip of dread. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't move. My feet felt heavy, like they were glued to the floor. The symbol on the wall seemed to pulse now, each beat of its twisted shape drawing me closer to it, making my heart thud in my chest. My phone, which had been in my pocket, suddenly felt too warm. I pulled it out, desperate for a distraction, desperate to ground myself back in the world I understood. The screen flickered as it powered on, then flashed bright, too bright. The light hurt my eyes like the phone was trying to tell me something. But before I could make sense of it, the screen went black again. I tried to leave. I really did. But as I turned to step back into the doorway, the house creaked, then groaned. The door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. Panic hit, cold and sharp. I pounded on the door, yelled, kicked the walls, but there was no sound, no answer. My phone still wouldn't turn back on. I was trapped, alone, in the dark, suffocating air. Leave now. The voice again, louder this time, but not in my mind. It was coming from all around me, reverberating through the walls, through the floor. The floorboards beneath me groaned in protest, and the shadows in the corners seemed to move. I looked up, heart pounding, to see the symbols on the walls shifting, growing longer, twisting into shapes that shouldn't have been possible. The air was thick with something else, something ancient and foul, and I couldn't breathe. Suddenly, a dark figure appeared in the doorway. The door I hadn't seen open. I gasped and stumbled back. The figure stood there, tall and cloaked, its face hidden in the deep shadow of its hood. I told you to leave. I don't remember much after that. Just flashes of images, endless trees, whispers too far away to understand, a cold wind that cut through my very soul. When I woke up, I was outside, lying in the dirt at the edge of the forest. My phone was cracked in my hand, the screen still black. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the land. The cabin was gone. The forest was still. And that was when I understood. I had walked into something old, something not meant to be disturbed. And now I wasn't sure I could ever leave. The woods didn't want me gone. They wanted me to stay. And when they finally claimed me, they would make sure I never left again. Let's start a new story. It was a Tuesday morning when I found the box. Not in the usual spot. No, this time it wasn't under my desk at work or in the back of the closet. I found it while running errands on a street I'd driven down 100 times. And that, in itself, should have been the first warning sign. It was there, on a bench at the bus stop. A small cardboard box, the kind you might use to store old photographs or leftover packing materials. Nothing fancy, just plain brown with a crinkled, faded label. It was placed neatly on the bench, as though someone had left it there for someone else. It was a strange place to leave a box, but even stranger was the faint, almost imperceptible noise coming from it. Like a soft hum, not loud enough to catch anyone's attention, but enough for me to notice. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but as I got closer, it became undeniable. Now, I'm not one to ignore curiosity. It's what gets me into trouble half the time. But even so, there's a small part of me that knew better than to open a random box on a city bench. But then I thought, what if it's meant for me? And that's how I ended up sitting down on that bench, lifting the lid and peering inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It was sweet, but not in any way I'd ever experienced before, like honey mixed with fresh rain. Not chemical, not artificial, real, almost earthy. There were no markings inside the box, just a bundle of old newspaper wrapped around something soft. When I pulled it open, there was a small stone nestled inside, roughly the size of my palm, with a smooth surface that seemed to shimmer despite the overcast sky. I didn't know what it was, whether it was a piece of jewelry, a rare gem, or something else entirely. I thought maybe it was a rock someone had left behind, but it didn't feel like one. There was something alive about it. I should have left it there, but I didn't. I took it, of course. I tucked it into my bag, convinced that somehow the stone had chosen me, or at least it wanted to be found. It didn't take long for things to get weird. That night, I set the stone on my coffee table. I couldn't stop staring at it. Every time I glanced away, I felt like I'd missed something important. The longer I looked, the more it seemed to shift in shape, as if it were slowly reforming itself, though I could never quite pinpoint how. It was subtle, an imperceptible glimmer, a brief distortion like light bending around it in a way that wasn't quite right. Then came the dreams. The first one was vivid, too vivid. It started with me standing in the middle of a vast desert. There was no sky, just endless sand stretching out in all directions. In the distance, I saw a figure, tall and indistinct, walking toward me. As it approached, I felt a strange sense of recognition, though I couldn't place why. It was as though this person, this thing, had been waiting for me. "Why did you take it?" the figure asked in a voice that wasn't quite human. It sounded both far away and directly inside my head at the same time. "Why did you choose?" I woke up sweating, heart racing. The stone was still on the coffee table, but something had changed. It felt heavier now, more present. I didn't know what I was dealing with, but that night, I tried to return it. I drove back to the bus stop, but the bench was empty. The box was gone. The street, which had seemed so familiar only hours before, felt different now, somehow more alien. The hum in the air, the one I hadn't noticed before, was suddenly too loud. It was buzzing in my ears, like a swarm of bees had made its home inside my skull. The next morning, things got stranger. The stone started to glow. At first, it was barely noticeable, a faint pulse, a dim light that seemed to come from deep inside the stone itself. But by the time the sun set, it was shining brighter, casting odd reflections across my apartment. I felt like I was being watched, even when I was alone. Then it spoke. I don't mean I heard something. I mean it spoke with a voice I could feel rather than hear. It was in my chest and my throat, pressing into my bones. "You have questions," it said, "but you must listen. You must understand what you've taken." I stared at the stone, frozen in place. "What are you?" I whispered, though the question felt unnecessary. "I am a bridge," it answered, "a link between places that do not exist." I could hardly breathe. "What places?" The stone pulsed again, and the world around me seemed to waver, like a mirage in the desert. The walls of my apartment twisted, then melted away, and I was standing on the edge of a cliff overlooking a dark, swirling ocean. There was no land in sight, just waves that reached endlessly into a black sky. It felt wrong, like something ancient, something vast had opened its eyes and was watching me. "You stand between worlds," the stone whispered, its voice growing distant. "One is real, the other is not." The ocean churned violently, and I felt myself being pulled toward it. I screamed, but there was no sound, just the rushing of wind and the crashing of waves. Someone was trying to drag me into the water. I jerked awake, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. My apartment was back to normal, the stone still resting on the coffee table, though now it felt quieter, more satisfied. Over the next few days, I tried to forget about it. I told myself I was just tired, that maybe I'd been hallucinating. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever the stone was, it had chosen me for a reason. I did some research, though I didn't find much. Some old myth about stones that acted as portals between real and unreal realms, about people who were never quite the same after finding them. And then I found something that made my blood run cold. A legend of a bridge that could not be crossed, a path that should not be walked. And that's when I knew I had to make a choice. You see, I'm starting to realize that the stone didn't just find me. It's been waiting for me. And now, it's asking something of me. Something that I don't fully understand, but feel in every breath, every beat of my heart. Maybe it's a gift. Maybe it's a curse. I don't know yet, but I do know this. I'm not alone anymore. And neither are you. Have you ever found something, an object, a moment, or even a feeling that seemed to choose you? Something that whispered to you, no matter how much you tried to ignore it? Because I think we all have bridges to cross, whether we're ready or not. Let's start a new story. I recently realized something strange about the way we experience time now. It's as if the clock's been swapped out for a treadmill, and no matter how fast we run, it still feels like we're stuck in place. This wasn't some great revelation I had while sitting under a tree or meditating at sunrise. No, it happened while I was watching a YouTube video about how to make your own soap. I'd clicked on it thinking I could get a quick tip on homemade face masks. But of course, 20 minutes later, I was sitting there with a glazed look, listening intently to someone explain the intricate process of soap making, all while surrounded by tiny jars of organic oils and herbs. I hadn't planned to spend my evening on this, but in a way, that's exactly how the whole day had gone. It's like this now. I wake up, Check my phone because that's how you know you're still alive. And before my feet even touch the floor, I've already spiraled through half a dozen Instagram stories and answered 2 emails. The first hour of my day is a blur of scrolling, clicking, and replying, punctuated by a quick glance at the clock, which always seems to be moving faster than it should. In the old days, I'd open the window to let the sun in, and the smell of coffee would greet me like an old friend. But now, coffee arrives courtesy of an app, and the sun gets filtered through the blue light of my phone. Now, I know what you're thinking. This sounds like one of those posts where someone grumbles about technology making us lazy or disconnected. But that's not it. Honestly, I think technology's done a pretty good job of keeping us connected. The problem, if you can call it that, is how it's made everything feel like a performance. Every notification feels like a mini broadcast to the world, and you can't help but wonder, am I getting this right? I remember when social media was simple. You post a picture of your lunch, and that was that. Maybe your aunt would comment, "Looks delicious," and your friend would leave an emoji of a fork and knife. There was a time when a selfie didn't come with a 20-minute debate on the right angle, lighting, and the perfect filter that will make you look like you just spent a week in a meditation retreat. But now, the pressure to craft the right narrative, whether it's your coffee, your breakfast, or your weekend, has turned mundane moments into events. It's like we all agreed at some point that everything needs a soundtrack, even if that soundtrack is just the constant whir of our mental gears trying to keep up. So, back to the soap video. Somewhere between the how-to instructions and the 15-second slow-motion shots of lavender buds falling into cauldrons of melted soap base, I realized I had somehow forgotten to exist in the moment. I wasn't watching the video for enjoyment anymore. I was checking off some kind of weird to-do list in my brain, learn how to make soap, but in the process, I missed the part where I was supposed to actually feel it. There was no joy in it. No wonder. I was too busy cataloging every thought in my head like an anxious librarian. Oh, that's an interesting point about the lye solution. Wait, do I need to buy lye? What other things do I need? Oh, right, so this, I think, is the core of the problem with modern life. We're all trying to be productive in a world that increasingly values our attention over our time. We've created an economy of distractions, where even the things that should be relaxing, like watching a soap-making video or drinking a cup of coffee, become chores that we need to do efficiently. The thing is, I never signed up for this. None of us did. Yet here we are, and there's no real guidebook for how to slow down when the world keeps speeding up. And don't even get me started on the notifications. I sometimes think the most time-consuming thing in my life is not the work I do or the people I need to talk to, but the endless list of digital responsibilities that pop up throughout the day. The group chat that's moved on to 40 new messages since I last checked it. The email from a service I subscribed to but never read. The ad for the product I didn't ask for, but somehow the algorithm knows I will absolutely want in 3 weeks. Every interaction is so damn efficient that I feel like I'm supposed to respond to them like they're urgent. And all of a sudden, I'm running around trying to answer every notification, every ping, every beep. Yet nothing ever feels done. Ever. But I think there's a bigger problem at play here. It's not just that our days have become this endless cycle of checking boxes. It's that we've forgotten how to simply be. When's the last time you sat down and did nothing? Not just scrolled through your phone or watched a TV show, but truly did nothing? No planning, no thinking, just existing. I tried it once, and within 10 minutes, I was thinking about whether I'd eaten enough fiber that day. In other words, I can't even sit still for 10 minutes without my brain getting itchy. This brings me back to the soap video. You see, I didn't just learn how to make soap that night. I learned how to let go in a small, subtle way of the feeling that every second needs to be packed with something meaningful, something measurable, something productive. Making soap wasn't productive. It wasn't efficient, but it was something real. I was mixing oils and watching them swirl together, slowly, with no agenda other than to make something that would eventually be used, just for the sake of using it. No one was going to give me a gold star for it. It wasn't going to go viral. And that's exactly what I needed, something that didn't have a scorecard attached to it. And you know what? After making that soap, I felt relaxed. Not the kind of relaxed where you tell yourself you're relaxed while checking your email, but genuinely relaxed in the way people used to be before they figured out how to market self-care. I was a human, doing something for no reason other than the joy of doing it. So, that's where I am now, trying to figure out how to exist in a world that constantly wants me to be doing something. Trying to figure out how to exist without the treadmill of productivity always underfoot, pushing me forward. But here's the fun part. I'm getting better at it. Slowly. I'm learning that it's okay to take a day off from efficiency. It's okay to leave things unfinished for a while. It's okay to just make soap without a plan. And honestly, that's something I think we could all use more of. So, if you're reading this and wondering how to slow down in a world that's speeding up, maybe try making some soap. Or do something just for you, no agenda, no goal. Just existing. And if you do, let me know. I'm curious. What's the last thing you did without trying to make it better or faster? Tell me, and I promise I'll listen without checking my phone. Let's start a new story. When I woke up, my pillow was crying. Quietly, but unmistakably. The sound was muffled, like someone trying to sob discreetly in a movie theater. I blinked at the ceiling, wondering if I was still dreaming. But no, the pillow sniffled again, and I realized it was shaking ever so slightly beneath my head. "Are you okay?" I asked, sitting up slowly. The pillow let out a dramatic exhale, like it had been waiting for me to notice. "Do I look okay?" It whimpered, its voice soft but saturated with despair. "Every night, you mash me into the same position, and then you drool on me like I'm some kind of sponge. I have feelings, you know?" I stared at it, unsure how to respond. I didn't know pillows could feel things. "Well, now you do," it sniffed. "And while we're on the subject, could you at least rotate me once in a while? I've got a flat spot the size of Wyoming." "Noted." I muttered, sliding off the bed, only to feel the mattress groan beneath me. "Easy there," it said, its voice deep and gravelly. "Do I look like I'm made of steel? You flop down on me every night like a sack of potatoes, and I don't even get a thank you." "I didn't think mattresses needed thanks," I replied weakly. The mattress harumphed, and people wonder why we get lumpy. I needed coffee. Immediately. The moment I stepped onto the rug, it bristled under my feet. "Oh great," it muttered. "Here we go again. I hope you're planning to vacuum this week, because I can't keep swallowing crumbs like this. It's degrading. It's not like I'm dropping whole pizzas on you," I shot back. The rug gasped, offended. "Crumbs are crumbs. It's the principle." I rolled my eyes and trudged into the bathroom, determined to ignore whatever drama my belongings decided to throw at me next. But the mirror was already waiting, gleaming with smug energy. Well, it said, "Look who finally rolled out of bed. You're looking, let's call it authentic." "Thanks," I muttered, splashing water on my face. The faucet chuckled. "That's not going to fix it." "What's that supposed to mean?" I demanded, glaring into the mirror. The toothbrush cut in, its tone so cheerful it bordered on manic. "Ooh, tension in the bathroom. I love a little morning drama." "Okay, big guy, let's hit those molars. No skipping this time." As I brushed, the toothpaste tube chimed in, groaning with every squeeze. "Seriously? From the middle again? Why don't you just stomp on me while you're at it?" I spat into the sink and left the bathroom in a hurry, too rattled to argue with dental hygiene products. The kitchen had to be better. Surely, the kitchen wouldn't have opinions. Spoiler alert, it did. The fridge rumbled ominously as I opened it. "What are you even looking for?" it asked. "Don't tell me you're going to eat that yogurt. It expired 3 days ago." I hesitated. "It's fine. Expiration dates are just suggestions." The fridge let out a low, judgmental hum. "Yeah, tell yourself that when you're doubled over in pain at 3 a.m. I grabbed the yogurt anyway, only for the spoon to pipe up as I reached for it. "Oh, great," it said, sounding both exhausted and sarcastic. "Another joyless breakfast. Why don't you ever use me for something fun? Ice cream, maybe. Or pudding. Remember pudding? Not now, spoon. Not ever, apparently," it muttered darkly. Desperate for caffeine, I turned to the coffee machine. It was unusually silent as I filled it with water, which should have been a relief. Instead, it felt ominous, like the quiet before a storm. Finally, it gurgled to life. "Oh, I see how it is," it said. "Another day, another pot of liquid adrenaline. You ever think about giving me a break? Maybe trying tea?" "No, of course not. Not in the mood, coffee maker." "You're never in the mood," it retorted before letting out a resigned hiss of steam. As the coffee brewed, I leaned against the counter, staring out the kitchen window. The birds on the power line outside were chirping, but now I understood exactly what they were saying. "Do you see what he's wearing?" one sparrow whispered. "Oh, it's tragic," another replied. "Those slippers? With those sweatpants? It's like he doesn't even care. Maybe he's going through something," the first bird suggested sympathetically. "Yeah," the second bird said. "A style crisis." I closed the blinds. By the time I sat down with my coffee, my chair was already complaining. "You've got to stop slouching," it said, shifting beneath me. "I'm not here to support your bad posture. I'm a chair, not a chiropractor." "Thanks for the advice," I muttered, taking a sip. The coffee mug, which had remained suspiciously quiet until now, finally spoke up. "Hot," it said. "Really hot. Ever think about giving me a heads up before you pour molten lava into me?" "No." "Cool." I sighed, setting the mug down carefully. "Is there anything in this house that doesn't have an opinion?" The room fell silent for a moment, as if all the objects were collectively holding their breath. Then, from the corner, the vacuum cleaner muttered, "I'd like to weigh in." I groaned. By the end of the day, I had accepted that this was my new reality. The world around me had come alive. Every object, every surface, every random thing I'd taken for granted now had a voice. And while most of those voices were sarcastic, judgmental, or deeply offended by my life choices, they were also oddly comforting. For the first time, my home didn't feel empty. It was chaotic, sure, but it was also full of personality, humor, and the kind of unfiltered honesty that only a sentient coffee maker could deliver. So now I have to ask, if the objects around you started talking, would you embrace it? Or would you desperately try to find the mute button? And honestly, how do you think your toothbrush feels about you right now?